The dawn crept toward the city as if unwilling, a pallid smear of light that found no good reason to cross the black water and set its hands upon the stones. For a long time the river held its night, choked with tar scent and the faint slick of fish gut, gulls turning slow white circles and scolding what they could not see. On the eastern horizon the promise of day lay thin and brittle as an eggshell, and the breeze that came off the water felt more like a held breath than any honest wind. The gates were still shut, the towers kept their silence. Far inland, beyond where the city's watchfires ended and the wild tangles of the Kingswood began, a small set of bells chimed in some country sept that no one here could hear. Within the Red Keep, the girl woke from dreams she could not recall and lay still, watching the pale strip of dawn widen along the casement until it chased shadow from the rushes. She had learned the city's dawns by their smells: tar and beans and horses, the sour spice of fermenting grapes from the cellars, the breath of damp stone. This morning brought the faintest ghost of rain, though outside the sky was colorless and dry. She sat up under the linen and reached for the cloak folded at the foot of the bed, drawing it around her shoulders with the reflex of someone who had learned to hide warmth wherever she could find it. Her knuckles had a fine spray of healing scratches where a maid had pressed a silver hairpin too hard and then apologized in a whisper as if the walls had ears. The girl flexed her fingers and stood, and the silk hem kissed the cold flagstones. The corridors of the keep never quite slept. There were always slippers whispering just beyond the turn, always a boy carrying a coal pan that sighed when the draft found it, always a guard in greaves that did not fit his ankles no matter how he tightened the straps. She took the path she had been instructed was safe at this hour, the one that looped twice around the inner stair and crossed the gallery where a tapestry of a long-dead king hunted a stag whose eyes were stitched with black silk. The tapestry's fringe brushed her cheek, and she paused, caught for a heartbeat by the weight of thread and history, by the patience in those woven hounds and the stag's taut back legs. Then she moved on, careful with the angle of her face, as if by offering only a sliver of her profile she might become thinner than a rumor and pass unremarked. In the small sept-off the Queen's solar, beeswax burned in sconces set with jasper, and smoke gathered in the folded vaults like the words of prayers that no one quite dared to speak aloud. A woman in a green gown sat in the front pew, head bowed, hands clasped over an amethyst ring. There was steadiness in the way she held her spine. She could have been a statue of herself. When she raised her head and saw the girl, a smile moved across her face the way wind stirs the surface of a still pond, rippling and gone. The woman did not love her, but on good mornings she pretended well. "So early?" the woman said in a voice that felt oiled, friendly in the way of a latch that has been opened and closed too often. "I woke," the girl said. "Did you dream?" "I don't remember." "Fortunate." They sat together a while, not quite so close as to touch. The Queen studied the candles. The girl studied the Queen's hands and thought of a different pair, roughened by northern winters, that had brushed snow from her braid once and then laughed at their own clumsiness, and she swallowed and forbore to follow the thought any farther. The Queen spoke of the day, a visit from a certain merchant of spice, a change in the kitchen's offices because someone had been found skimming flour, the expectation that her son would go to the sept at noon to be cheered by the crowd because the crowd must remember what it was to cheer. "It is a city," the Queen said, "and it will behave like any city left too long to animal appetites. We feed it with spectacle and it feeds us with loyalty. For now." She stood and smoothed her gown and touched the girl's cheek with 2 fingers, not for comfort but to mark the gesture. "Be good. Be lovely. Say little. I will send for you when it is time." "Yes, my lady," the girl said. "Your Grace," the Queen corrected. "But perhaps one day you shall not need reminding." She left in a rustle like rain over silk. When the girl was alone, the beeswax seemed to magnify the quiet, the flames leaning in their sconces, the room's light steady as a held note. In another life, she thought, she would have learned the names of all the saints in these painted panels and the stories of each, their emblem birds and their martyrdoms, and perhaps the stories would have made them feel like companions. Instead, she had remembered the names of the guards who disliked their posts and the scullions who would trade a message for a heel of bread. She had learned the habits of silence, small queenly habits applied to a life that was not her own. When she knelt, it was not to those saints, though she nodded to them as one nods to neighbors. She knelt and pressed her forehead against her fingers like a bridge, and the words that came had no shape and no shrine to be posted in. They were only a wanting the size of winter. Let it be quick, let it be kind, let it be soon. Across the river flats, miles away where the Kingswood tossed its dark shoulders and let loose a few stray leaves that went skittering like brown fish over the packed dirt road, a wolfhound of gray shadows slipped between trees and bounded a long quiet arc to where the young man waited astride a bay horse whose ears kept moving like questions. The man leaned forward and the animal came up and pressed its muzzle to his boot in an intimacy that did not belong to tame beasts. The young man felt the old, particular comfort flood him, the surety of the animal's nearness, the way the world felt more itself when reckoned also by the wolf's senses. He had come to trust that sense more than any map. When the wolf was uneasy, he watched. When the wolf was glad, he breathed easier. Now the wolf's breath steamed in the thin morning light, and its eyes were the depth of wet bark. At his back, men waited, not the full host. He had left bulk and noise to another general with orders to make smoke and show banners where they were meant to be seen. The band here was sinew and quiet, a long, narrow spearhead wrapped in old cloth to muffle it. Some were northern men, big shoulders and boiled leather sewn by wives whose needles had learned to hurry without losing neatness. Some were river men, lean, long-faced, as at ease in a boat as on a horse, and there were others whose given names would be forgotten but whose feet would remember fountains of stone, gutters, market stalls, alleyways that did not belong to the north or the rivers. By the young man's knee, the old knight in black fish scales stood with his visor lifted and his hair gone to iron. "The wind presses east," the knight said. "The river will take a smell of us into the city if we're not careful. We will move before the wind gathers," the young man said. He kept his voice low for the sake of the morning. "And we will smell of fish." He glanced to where 3 carts, each drawn by a placid ox, stood loaded in the grass, the canvas tarp edges darkened with fish slime. "Has he come?" The old knight tilted his head a fraction. "He will. He knows both the worth and the danger of tardiness." The young man nodded and kept his eyes on the line of the trees. Gray Wind's ears pricked. A small shape detached itself from the underbrush, a boy in a cloak too large for him and trousers that had known market floors. The boy had that particular angular wariness the city taught, pride in pitiable things, a belt that had once fit a grown man, a pair of shoes with 3 nails still holding. He came forward unstartled by the wolf, as if he had been told what animal would greet him and had measured his fear to size. "You must not speak names," the boy said without greeting. His voice was like a reed pipe, carrying farther than he knew. "Come with me." The old knight moved his hand, and a second man, with a scar over his mouth that made even his pleasure look grave, stepped forward to take the boy to one side. "Show me with your hand," the scarred man said. "Here is the river. Here the gate. Here the streets." The scar slashed his diligence to severity. The boy's finger went from one invisible thing to another. "They will move men to the king's gate for noon," the boy said. "There will be cheering for him. There will be dice for which troop must guard his mother's wine, and they will go to dice with a certain thought in their heads. The men you think of, the ones who thought to stay true to one office over another, half of them have been reassigned to a warehouse by the docks where no one will count the wine twice. The man with the pointed beard fears the chain more than he trusts it." "And our friends?" asked the scarred man. "They have their instructions," the boy said carefully, because the words were not his own. "But there is a third shift that does not belong to any of the named. You will not expect them. You must not let that keep you from expecting them." "How many?" asked the old knight, stepping nearer. The boy's mouth moved as if he counted on the pads of his fingers beneath the cloth. "Enough to spoil a story," he said, and he looked up at the young man then in that direct way children kept before the city taught them the cost. "You will go in at the water. You will need patience at the lock. There is a sound to the lock that is like a cough. Remember it. The men you brought have been taught a word to keep their feet with. If they forget the word, tell them instead to remember their names." "What payment?" asked the scarred man. The boy found a straightness in himself that astonished him. He said, "I would be remembered." He said my mother's rent would be paid by someone who sent ducks. He said my sister would go to a place where they make candles. He said I should tell you that if you make a promise, he will keep it for you. "We will keep our own," said the young man, "and we will need his." The boy stared at the wolf. The wolf stared back and licked its lower jaw. The boy grinned, sudden and brief, and his face became something it had not yet had time to become, a man's face laughing. Then the grin went like a tossed fish into a basket, and the boy turned and threaded back the way he had come, steps light, shoulders set against the trees. "He was well taught," said the old knight. "He was," said the young man, thinking. "There is a gift in that, and also a cruelty. A city breeds both more efficiently than any hothouse," the black fish said, and he raised his visor and let the cool morning touch his face, and the lines at his mouth looked like things carved by a careful knife. From the south, the good brother of some small holdfast would later recall. There rose a drift of smoke from the market at the edge of the Kingswood. Someone burning damp wood, or someone warning someone else with a sign that could be mistaken for cooking. The young man's men harnessed themselves quietly to carts that smelled of old nets and worse. A dozen of them kept to the river's titterline as if they were only a crew of fish sellers without the sense to leave night's work to night and day's work to day. They made a picture of the sort of bustle no one ever looked at twice unless the smell blew wrong. The rest went by the path the boy had shown, where a ditch cut in the old king's day carried runoff down to the river through a wooden channel no one had replaced in 3 summers. The secret places of a city are not those hidden by intention. They are those everyone knows and no one remembers to see. In the Tower of the Hand, the small man with the large head held a piece of bread in napkin-folded chui. CE, and he chewed slowly and looked at the parchment that someone had left on his desk, as if by leaving something where he could not fail to see it one had done all that duty required. He read the thing twice. It was straightforward and clever in the way of a child who has grown practiced at placing the weight of a lie on the least stubborn sentence. He rubbed his thumb over the place where the seal had been and thought of the chain that should be finished by now and of how men believed in iron when what they needed to be careful of was rope. He was not a superstitious man. He believed in appetite, in accident, and in the strange regularities a city made out of both, which men then called luck for want of another word. But he had learned to listen when his bones felt the morning slide in a direction he could not name. At the window, the river lay dull and sullen. The tar on the water was like a thought someone had tried to blot and had only managed to smear. He did not like that. He did not like that any more than he liked the page's ear turned down on a book he had not finished, or the way the candles in this room burned with a small cup of unspent wax around each blackened wick. It meant things wished to be whole and could not find their way back to it. He folded the parchment and placed it under the stone paperweight shaped like a lion's head someone had thought would flatter him. Then he rose and went to the door. The man outside, one of his chosen, straightened and was so anxious to be seen straightening that he cracked the back of his head on the wall. The small man hid his smile and walked, and the man followed at his heel like a dog hopeful of more responsibility than his teeth could bear. The tower's stairs smelled of cold and onions and oils. He loved the smell of onions. It was honest and almost always told the truth. He passed men who carried ledger books and a woman who carried her dignity like the last gift of a mother who had died in childbirth. He passed a boy whose hands were stained green from counting a sort of coin. This last was a useful stain. He nodded to it and went on. When he reached the bailey, the wind touched his cheek and found nothing there that it liked. He turned his face toward the city and listened. That was his best trick. He listened until what seemed like a confusion of noises separated themselves into strands, and then he tugged at a strand and followed it back to the knot. He could hear hawkers calling the names of grapes. He could hear a bucket dropped and the bottom splitting. He could hear the measured steps of a guard who took pride in counting. And beneath all that, quiet but a true note, he heard something like the beginning of a song. Men speaking low over a shared word, the way soldiers share prayers that have been stripped of gods and leave only the discipline of a shared breath. "Brawn," he said, and the cell's word, who had come up beside him on the sort of quiet step that he thought was invisible because it had always worked so far, grunted his readiness. Find me Bywater, where he is, not where he is supposed to be. Bring him to me. Tell no one else." He paused. "And go down along the waterside. Smell what you can smell." "You pay me to smell now?" Bronn asked without insolence and went off smiling. The small man stood a while. He thought of how men made mistakes on the morning after they had made two good decisions. Good decisions breed complacency faster than bad ones birth caution. He tucked his hands into his belt and looked to the black cloth that covered a culvert on the river road. He wondered who had ordered it covered and who had signed the order, and whether the ink had been completely dry when the man took the brandy someone offered him afterward in reward for a job that had been cheaply done. Far off in the Kingswood, the young man riding at the head of a small procession of carts filled with fish considered very carefully where he would place his right hand when the moment came. Not on the hilt at first, because a hand there tells the man across from you that you are ready to be a sword and thus invites him to become a sword as well. No, on the edge of the cart, palm down as if to steady it. A man who steadies a cart looks like a man who understands load-bearing things and is unlikely to be moved by shouting. Then, when the shouting comes anyway, the hand may move but not before. He imagined his mother's expression if she could see him put his hand to a cart of fish. It would be the small smile within her larger one, the one that knew laughter but refused to spend it. He could feel her near even now, a sort of weather in him, and he was foolishly comforted by it. The Watergate was where the river remembers it belongs to the city and allows itself to be disciplined into neatness. It was a smaller thing than its name, a tunnel of fitted stone meant politely rather than honestly for commerce, the sort of passage a city makes when it intends to go on living and therefore needs to relieve itself in an orderly fashion into the places where people do not wish to think of what it does. Two guards stood where they had always stood, one leaning heavily against his boredom as if it had a door to lean on. Their pikes were upright and resting, and their eyes were resting as well, one on the river as if it might say something interesting if given time, the other pinned to a point in the middle distance. When the carts came, the men did not rouse quickly. They had already been spoken to twice this morning by men with goods of less honest odor, and the act of inspection had used up the tightness of their day. But there was a third man in the shadow of the arch whose helmet had been brushed clean within the last hour. He had the expression of a clerk newly given a blade to balance in his ledger. He frowned at the arrival and gestured to the carts. "Not today," he said. "Not until the bell. The lock's sticky as a hag's throat, and I'll have it jammed proper if we try to shove those tubs through now." The man at the head of the cart lifted his eyes slowly and let them rest on the third guard's clean brim, as if he saw there a story worth hearing again. He did not move his right hand. "Fish don't keep for bells," he said. "Fish keep for what we say they keep for," the third guard replied, gratified by the chance to say a thing that sounded like it had been said before. He took a step, and the men in the shadow behind him shifted their weight the way a school of fish shifts, mirroring, not exactly aware. The young man put his left hand on the rim of the cart. He let his right hand hover, quiet and uninteresting. "Smell them," he said. "What?" said the guard, wrong-footed. "Smell them," the young man repeated, and when he spoke he let a little bit of the road into his voice so that it carried the dull patience of people who move weight from one place to another for a living. "Either we take them through at the Watergate and the city eats fish for noon, or we leave them here, and the sun rises upon them, and by noon they are good for nothing but the gardens behind the sept, which everyone says need feeding but never by fish. Go on. Smell." The guard's nostrils flared. The smell was truth. He did not wish to be the man who had made the whole quay smell of rot on a day when the king would call for cheers. He chewed at his lip. The habit made him look much younger, briefly. "It sticks," he protested. But now it was less a flat refusal than an appeal to the air's better nature. "I'll help you," the young man said, and now he did move his right hand. It moved not to his sword but to a set of grapples and ropes. "My arms are good. My men are patient. We'll take it through between bells." The third guard glanced left and right. He looked at the river. He looked at the men on his own side and saw that their faces had softened toward the fish as men's faces do when the practical presents itself as mercy. He nodded, and with that tiny tilt of his head he made room in the day for a different set of events. "Between bells," he said, And then, a second time, as if to bind spell to story, between bells. They made a picture of labor then. The men at the ropes bent their weight against the lock while the boy inside the mechanism did what the boy had been taught. Listening for the cough, letting the patience in his hands resound through the wooden teeth until the thing chose to yield to the human fact of need. The water changed its sound. It went from a throat to something like the clearing of one. The third guard said, "There," in satisfaction as if he had done it, and the carts rolled, and the smell of cold scales and old nets preceded them into the city like the flag of a poor nation. Elsewhere in the city, a man whose beard never grew even on both sides found his pockets heavier than they had been at dawn and did not ask why, because asking was the part of his work he had never liked. At the mud gate, a woman held a wooden spoon in her hand with such authority that none of the men within 10 paces dared to mention that it was a spoon and not a mace. Beneath a counting house by the Street of Sisters, a trapdoor accepted 3 men at intervals and returned them at different intervals, and no one forgot to close it behind them. In the dungeons of the city, a jailer turned his head and whistled a part of a country dance that he had danced once with a girl whose name he had lost, and so he did not see the thing that moved behind him. Afterward, he told himself he had not seen it because it had not wanted to be seen. And in the Red Keep, the queen drank small gulps of watered wine as if to keep fear from drying her tongue, and when her cousin came to her breathless with some half-story of a disturbance by the water, she slapped his cheek, and when his cheek colored she felt better. She told him to find the boy king and remind him of lines he was to speak at noon, and the boy cousin went and did not. The small man with the large head found Bywater at last not where he had sent him but where he himself would have gone if he had been Bywater, which was on a low parapet above the outer yard where one could hear the echo of footsteps and tell what kind of men wore the feet that made them. The hand did not waste words. He said what he had to, that there would be carts, that men would be tired in the places where the city was weakest and arrogant in the places where it was not as strong as it thought. Bywater listened. He was good at listening. He bent his head as if rain were falling and tugging secrets out of the air. "Shall I shift men from the mud gate?" Bywater asked. "Not yet," the hand said. "Let us not make the shape of panic before panic makes the shape of us. Take 3 men you trust like a saint and a priest, and put them where they can see the water gate, but not so near they can be counted. And tell them not to do anything, not a thing. Look first, then we will think, and then we will act." Bywater nodded. "And your cell's word?" "I sent him to smell the city," the hand said. "He will bring word if the wind changes. And if it does, then we will pretend we were born for that weather," said the small man. In a lane off the Street of Flower, the girl from the keep went with a chaperone and 3 maids to see a puppeteer whose puppets laughed in voices very like the real people they mocked. It had been decided this would be good for her, and therefore it was arranged to be good for her. The chaperone had a nose like an accusing finger and sniffed at each thing the city offered. The pies, the boys with garlands of rosemary, the clear girl voices singing a filthy song until someone cuffed their ears. The puppeteer wrung laughter from his crowd without malice, which is the harder way. The girl smiled and forgot, for 3 whole minutes together, where she was. When she remembered again, the smile did not leave her face. But she had that feeling one has when waking from a too brief nap into a noise. The chaperone took her elbow and steered her back through the marketplace, and the maids followed, and somewhere not far off a bell sounded 1, then 2, then 3 strokes that meant something to the men who had been told what they meant and nothing to anyone else at all. In the dark beneath the water gate, the wolf had picked its way over planks and old ropes and the detritus of 100 unloaded cargoes. It disliked the smell of old tar as thoroughly as its man did, and it wrinkled its lips and showed 2 inches of fong that were ivory as church offerings. When the first of the men with fish shouldered their way along the tunnel, the wolf went before them as it had been taught, a gray thought weaving between calves, pausing at each new turn of air, tail high. The men worked quietly. Work has a way of quieting men that the promise of reward never quite manages. 1 lifted, 1 pulled, 1 checked knots, 1 counted, 1 touched the icon his mother had given him when he had left home to become a soldier in a cause he could not explain. They came out into the long shadow of the quay, and they broke the picture of labor for the smallest portion of a breath. And in that fragment, a man on the far wall who had been told he was to do nothing but look saw something. He was a good man, the sort of good man cities turn into bones in their foundations, and he did not move. He watched. He saw the way the young man kept his eyes low and the way the wolf kept its head high, and he smelled beneath fish the clean metal of discipline. He touched the hilt of his sword and decided, without words, that if he was to be wrong today, he would rather be wrong by silence than by calling a shout he could not unsay. The first gatehouse yielded to confidence. Men like to be told what they were going to do as if it had been their idea, and the young man did that. He pointed to a bolt that needed easing and made his shoulder the first to bear it, and men love a man who shoulders a thing, which is why so many bad men pretend to do it. By the second, they were inside. A pair of guards looked up from a game of squares with beans, and the young man set his hand down flat on the board and said their move was very fine and that he would wait, and the guards laughed and believed they had been left to finish it, and so they did, and that was that. Most of war is not steel. Most of war is this. You change what men think they are doing, and then you have changed what they are doing without drawing a blade. Above, somewhere far within the red stones, the small man and the queen crossed briefly in a corridor and said each other's names the way cats say each other's names, as if the very fact of the sound were proof the other existed chiefly in order to be supplied with milk or cut of liver. "Do keep your boy near you," the small man said. "He is near to all good things," the queen replied. "Ah," he said, and the syllable held both a knife edge and a shrug. At the king's gate, a squad of goldcloaks was being drilled by a captain newly promoted who had learned early that the best way to dispel an older man's disdain was to shout him hoarse. He had chosen to rubber his men's nerves with sudden charges because it looked like vigor, and because his mentor had favored a different style, and he had not yet discovered the trick of stealing another man's lessons and calling them your own. He saw nothing of fish or wolves. His world was the rectangle of this yard and the exquisite, controllable misery of men under orders. He would learn later that there are other miseries. The young man with the wolf moved without haste through the city's underparts and into its middling parts. He paused where the road from the water turned toward the market and lifted one hand, and behind him men did the curious thing good soldiers do at a sign they trust. They became less rather than more visible, not crouching but quieting, not hiding but removing the part of themselves that would insist on being seen. He breathed the air with his head a fraction to one side, as if listening with a part of himself not quite located in ear or nose. He sensed the city's attention still turned inward to its rituals, and in that narrow corridor of disinterest before any trumpet blast of alarm arranged the day, he threaded his men into the city's weave. He did not go straight to the Red Keep. A boy could have thought of that. He went to the sets of places where the city's grip on itself is fragile, corners where three narrow streets come together and then doubt their decision. The underside of staircases where people deposit what they will not claim. The alleys that run as seams between districts that disdain each other. He put a pair of men in a leatherworker's shop where the smell of tannin would cover the smell of iron. He put another pair in a bathhouse that had not opened yet where the drains afforded listening. He stationed a man who had no particular face under a cart that had no horse and would not be moved until night. He laid away pieces of his strength as a careful cook lays away currants and eggs for a festival cake, thinking of the hour when too many hands will be reaching into the bowl for what it cannot supply. All the while the wolf went on, passing through light like a thought inside a skull. It climbed a set of steps that were not meant for beasts, and a woman going down the other way made the sign her grandmother had taught her against fairies. The wolf licked its nose. The woman giggled in spite of herself, then looked around to see if anyone had seen her be a child, and when she discovered no one had she allowed herself another small giggle. The city made these inconsequential threads as it made 1,000 others, and all were woven into the same morning. Somewhere close to noon, bells began to wake one another. The first was formal and a little too slow, a bell that considered itself the parent of other bells. Then the smaller ones, higher and more nimble, took up the task and made it music. Men set down their tools to wipe their hands and prepare to cheer. In a cell where light sliced down through a grill in the ceiling, a man who had killed another man with careful, powerful strokes flexed his hands as if the bells played only for him. In the queen's solar, the boy with the crown put on his best smile that had been practiced in a mirror. he did it easily because he was practiced at many things that did not require wherewithal. The queen looked at him and saw not the man he was not but the child she had made, and the feeling ran through her like a sour wine. "Remember what we spoke of," she said, and the boy smirked. "I will remind them who has a sword and who has a tongue," he said, echoing poorly a witticism he had once heard from someone clever. "Better," said the queen. "Remember that their cheering is a sort of tax. Let them pay it gladly. If you must speak, speak as if you had no need to, and you will sound like a king." He preened and let the jewel light from the window centers be caught on his pale hair, and he imagined the city as a stage. Men who imagine cities as stages are always surprised when the scenery proves to have depth. They moved then in a little cortege toward the September. The maids went to their places. The chaperone smoothed her gown and arranged her face upon its shelf for public viewing. The girl stood in the line where she had been told to stand, and she knew where the queen's eyes would rest when they dipped to summon her for some ornamental function. And she had already measured how many steps it would take to reach the dais and how many steps back, and what sentences to say that would please, and how much fear she could keep out of her voice. This calculation had become her second language. The small man had positioned his chosen people as he could, and he had told 2 of them to change their clothes for those of a poorer sort. And he had sent a woman with a barrel of sawdust to the base of the hill where the red keep's gates opened onto the city's long street with the instruction to slip if she saw men coming. And he had placed a boy on a tower where he could look for Wolf Grey with orders that were simple enough the boy could carry them and not crack from the effort. He had done all that and then persuaded himself to sit and eat the second half of his bread, because food is one of the few things over which one can exert honest control. He chewed slowly, and he did not taste it. Later, men would argue over when exactly the day turned. Some would say it turned when the fish carts passed under the river gate. Some would say it turned when the boy at the lock found the cough. Some would say the turning was present already in the dawn and simply completed itself at noon like a chapel bell finishing the swing it had begun at matins. But there was a moment that felt like a hinge, and it occurred on the steps of the September, where the boy king raised his hand for silence and felt the crowd's murmur relax by a degree. He had just parted his lips and formed the first vowel when the cry rose from the end of the square and arranged itself into a shape everyone understood, even if the words were new. The cry of men seeing what they had not expected to see. The young man on the bay horse rode into the light with the wolf at his knee, and the crowd did that thing crowds always do when they see a figure riding into the shape of myth. They made silence around their inhalation. It was only a heartbeat. Then came noise, but not the noise the court had prepared for. Not jeers, not cheers, but the splayed and warring categories of sound a city makes when its story encounters a rival story, questioning and threat and hope all jostling one another like elbows in a narrow alley. The small man on the tower closed his eyes for the span of one slow breath and then opened them, because seeing and not seeing are different kinds of treason to oneself. "Hold," the young man said, and he said it not to the crowd but to the men behind him, and they held because they had learned the difference between desire and instruction. He felt the wolf's hackles rise under his knee. He could smell, even over fish and tar and candle smoke and human breath, the tart sharpness of fear and the peppercreek scent of anger. They were spices he knew now, the way he had once known the smell of pine and snow. He thought of his father, not as a statue of a virtue, but as a man who had taught him how to keep a household. He thought of title not as a thing one holds above one's head, but as a basket one must carry. The boy king laughed, a laugh too high, and the queen's hand moved and then stilled. The king's guard drew lines in the air with their bodies. The gold cloaks looked at one another and waited for someone to tell them whether this was the sort of day in which one keeps to orders, or one makes a story of one's own that might be rewarded if things turn out. "Who are you to come thus?" cried one voice from the steps. Not the queen's, half indignation, half relief. The young man thought he knew it. He did not look at it. "I am a son," he said, and his voice did a thing it had learned to do in camps and on stony ground. It reached the back of the square without being louder than it needed to be. "I have come for a girl taken from her house. I have come for justice delayed by men's convenience. I have come to keep my men from dying at the wrong river. Open the gate to the keep. We will speak like men with names." He did not say any names. Names are tools, and one does not waste tools on the steps of a church. There was a disorder of motion at the top of the steps. The boy king had paled in a way that made his face look peeled. His mouth, which had been trained to smirk with such diligence, could not find the route to it again for a moment and flapped like a fish. He Queen's eyes narrowed and then warmed, and then narrowed again, and in that sequence was more of her soul than all her speeches contained. A Kingsguard's jaw clenched. In the crowd, a woman felt something like hunger and did not know if it was for bread or for the sight of a man brought low. The small man came down the steps alone. He did not wear armor. He did not even wear a sigil, because he was hung about him like a cloak no one could remove without cutting his throat, and even then the cloak would still be there. He approached the young man and took in wolf and horse and boys and men and smell, and he nodded once, a long, grave nod that had room in it for an apology that could not be spoken. "Make your men stand down," he said. "They are standing," said the young man. "So are yours. You have chosen a poor place for whatever this is," the small man said, letting irritation color the edges of his voice, because it would be easier for everyone if this could be made to feel like an insult to procedure rather than the thing it threatened to become. "The place is chosen," the young man said simply. "Open the gate. You know that even kings do not simply walk into the keep when someone says so," the small man said. "I also know that kings are kings because men consent to the story," the young man said, "and that the story in this city is tired of itself." "That is a dangerous bet," the small man said, "and you have men who will pay the interest." The young man let the corner of his mouth move a fraction. "Then let us not make the city pay the principal," he said. "Place me before the queen, or place the queen before me, or do neither, if you prefer the thing that will follow." "What thing?" asked the small man, not because he did not know but because he wished to hear this boy weigh it with the weight of his own mouth. "The thing men do when gates do not open," said the young man, and he glanced past the small man and let his eyes find the girl in the crowd. Her gaze was a lit candle. He felt it like heat. Why that should have surprised him he did not know. Since leaving the north he had learned that one is surprised less often by swords than by the harmless things. Bread where you expected none, a voice you had not counted on being brave. He made no signal. He nodded once to the air between them as if to a third person whom he respected. The small man looked toward the queen. He would have said he hated her if that had not been a simplification. He did not hate her. He hated the necessity she represented. He walked backward up 3 steps and gestured with his hand. Open, an actor's gesture, a host's. The queen, composed now in that way which to some reads as courage and to others as the gloving of the hand that will strike, descended 2 steps and stood where all could see her. "Do you propose," she asked, "to make war on the steps of the mother's house?" "I propose to end a war not started by me on a morning not chosen by me," said the young man. "But your gates close upon a girl who does not belong in your gates. I will not leave without her, and there are other wrongs we might discuss." "This is insolence," said the boy king, finding breath. The queen lifted a finger and did not look at him. "Which girl?" she asked, though she knew. She was buying herself time, but she would buy it at whatever market would sell it to her. "The one called hostage when convenient and guest when you required honeyed words," said the young man gently. "I will take her with me. Then we will talk of the terms under which I will leave your city without sacking it and your boy without losing a piece of himself. Terms that may suit you better than the ones you will get from others who would call you friend today and burn you tomorrow." The queen's mouth made that shape it made when it thought. It was a sour little curve. She looked to the small man as if to say, "Here is the beast you told me lay beyond the wall, and you have put me face to face with it." He raised his eyebrows by a hair. The crowd behaved as crowds do when they sense the luck of their day might be decided in a way that will not allow a do-over. They held their bodies tense with hope not to be noticed. The girl felt her heart making bird sounds in her chest, quick and insistent. She did not let her feet move. She thought of snow. She thought of her sister's hand, small and warm. She thought of her mother's voice and the way it could make a word sound like a rule and like kindness at once. She thought of the night when she had stood on a rampart and watched a star fall into the city and had made a wish that frightened her even as she made it, because some wishes, if heard, might cost too dear even if God is merciful. She did not think of the boy king at all. That absence in her thoughts was like a door closing on its own. "Bring the girl," said the queen at last, as if it had been her notion and all had merely been waiting to see what she would say. "And they will be searched before they come near the gate. And I will speak to him from within the gate, not outside it." The small man bowed, not for the queen but for the crowd, because the crowd loves a bow whether it is given to it or not. He took 2 steps and turned and looked at the young man. "No heroics," he said in a voice so flat that only a few people heard the sincerity in it. "No surprises. I have had enough of surprises," the young man said, and for a second they looked like 2 men discussing weather under an awning. The girl came forward like a sail filling. The movement was so simple that it surprised her. It is difficult to cross a room. It is easy to cross a city. It is hard to cross the space between fear and courage. It is easy to place one foot before the other. The crowd parted for her and for the maids and for the chaperone with the accusing nose, and in the narrow path they made she felt affronts brush one side of her and relief the other like all kinds of grasses. When she reached the bottom of the steps, she looked up at the young man and found him taller than she remembered, and she felt that drop in her belly that one feels on a sudden slope, and then a steadiness that met it and leveled it out. "I am ready," she said, and because her nurse had taught her very long ago to say please and thank you in the appropriate places, she added, "If you please." He did not offer his hand, not because he did not wish to but because he had learned that sometimes not touching is an act of better grace than touching. He turned his horse and walked it gently. The wolf moved like a second shadow. The crowd's murmur ran along the street like tide. Above, in the tower, the boy who had been told to look for Gray did so with an expression of joy that would have embarrassed him if anyone had seen. At the gate of the Red Keep the iron mouth of the portcullis waited with its teeth lowered. The queen stood within the threshold, rigid as if sculpted, and the small man stood at her right. Men with crossbows lined the walls. Men always do. No arrow had ever yet unmade the problem of too much history crammed into too little mourning. "Before we go any farther," the queen said, "you will order your men to lay down their arms." The young man shook his head. "No," he said, soft, almost pitying. "What I will do is order them to keep their peace, which is worth more than your order and harms you less than mine would." He looked up along the wall. "If any man shoots, the first man who dies will not be the one you wish. The second will be someone you love. The third will be the man who shot without orders, and he will be killed by his own for fear of repercussion. We would then have a street of corpses and this matter no closer to good settlement." "You speak as if you have come to make settlement," the small man said. "I have," said the young man. "I am not here to wear your chair. I am here to move my army home with my people and my men alive, and to do it with justice the size of what was done to mine. I have learned to distrust gifts that require more men's blood than I can count." "Finally," said the queen with a little snap of scorn, "he speaks sense." "We may find," said the small man, "that we agree on more than we imagined." "Your father," said the queen sharply, "has my brother, and your mother has taught you disrespect." "Your son had my father," said the young man, and the word had its weight. He had not spoken that name in this square. He had saved it for a place where it would not become a banner thrust into the wrong hands. "I am here to end that balance in a way that does not require any more fathers." The wolf sat, as if bored by all this human complication. A child in the crowd laughed and clapped, and the mother nearly twisted the child's ear off, then kissed it. "You will give me," said the young man, "your boy. You will give me your boy and your promises, and I will give you the city unburnt and a treaty that will keep it unburnt and your line unended. We will make an exchange in daylight. We will make it with witnesses. We will write a story that men will be forced to tell with their mouths for years afterward, because saying it out loud is how they remember it." The queen's face flamed and cooled, flamed and cooled. the brief passing of overflying emotions like clouds pouring their shadow on a field too quickly for the field to say which weather it was. "And if I refuse? Then this day becomes a scroll written in blood," said the young man. "And your friends who promised you their banners if you were clever, those friends will be late or early as suits their kitchens. You will live a little longer. Your boy may live a little less. Your city will have many funerals." "I am not moved by such threats," she snapped. "They are not threats," said the small man, tired now. "They are arithmetic." A long moment passed. It stretched and did not snap as one thinks it must. But then, as some threads do, it simply dissolved into a next thing. The queen turned and made a small gesture, and the men with her moved like a string on beads. The boy king was brought, indignant, rounded with privilege, still like a child whose cheeks have not been leaned out by hunger or responsibility. The wolf tilted its head. "You will be treated as a guest," the young man said to the boy king. "You will not be harmed. You will eat at my table. You will hear men speak honestly for a day. It will be a new experience." "You think I fear you?" the boy king said, doing his best to find disdain inside himself. "I do not fear wolves. I will have its pelt before sunset." "I doubt it," said the small man under his breath. The exchange happened in a movement that was not one movement but many carefully laid, overlapping small ones. The girl came forward at the same time the boy moved down. The doors were held. Men shifted their weight. A hand rested momentarily on a shoulder to steady a step-down stone. The young man's knee pressed to his horse's side. The wolf watched. The boy king lurched once as if surprised by gravity and then found his balance. The girl went past him, and their sleeves nearly brushed, and neither of them looked at the other. The queen's fingers flexed, small and helpless, and then settled on their ring. The small man exhaled, and his exhalation was an abstract of many things. Fatigue, relief, the knowledge that this was not the end of anything but only the movement from one part of a symphony to the next, where the horns would be louder. "Now," said the young man, "we will speak like men with names." They did not speak next in the square. They spoke in a room just within the gate, a room with slitted windows and a table that had saw marks still visible because some carpenter had been in a hurry and then realized that he had been making furniture for the Red Keep, but that the Red Keep required speed more than beauty that week. The small man sat on one side and the queen on the other, and the young man at the end, and the boy king, for the first time in his life, found himself obliged to sit on a stool without a cushion for more than a minute together. "What you want is treason," the queen began. "What you offer is treason. I will not lend my name to a pact that dishonors it." "What I want is a thing you cannot prevent," said the young man. "And what I offer is a way for you to pretend it honors you. Do not soften your throat with the word treason. Treason is when one intends to bind and cut. I intend to release. The North belongs to the North. The Riverlands belong to themselves. You will have your city. You will have the South. You will have a peace that allows your friends to see you alive long enough to envy you. You will have my armies marching away with all swiftness. The lords who ought to be at this table are absent," the queen said. "You would have me bargain for chairs that are not mine to give. Your lords stand behind you or upon you," the young man said. "Either way, they are upon you by your own choosing. If you prefer to wait, we can wait. But you will not like the way waiting looks." "Tyrell gold," she said. "A Tyrell army. Men whose appetite exceeds their discipline," said the young man, "and whose desire to sup with you today exceeds their desire to sit after. I do not need to tell you what they say of you in their halls when the fire is low and the wine lower." Her face made the expression of someone acknowledging an odor. She looked at the small man. "How eagerly," she asked, "must we play this game?" "I will answer as your hand," he said. "We must play it well. The boy is in our hands or theirs. We have chosen theirs. The girl is in ours. The city has not burned. The people now have a story to tell that portrays us as reasonable and our enemies as perhaps not holy monsters. It is not as bad a day as it could have been, could still become so. If you wish to keep your head and your house, you will dispense with fiction and tell the truth. You do not have the pieces to play any other way. She fixed him with a look that could have carved off a slice of a lesser man's patience. He did not blink. "It is not cowardice," he said, and his voice gentled. "It is cunning. You are too free with your counsel," she said, and he smiled bleakly, and the young man's eyes twitched in sympathy. "What I ask?" the young man said, laying it out now and feeling the odd pain that comes when one has thought a thing so long that saying it aloud feels like making visible a wound one had kept decently bandaged. "Is simple. Recognition of our secession. Safe passage for our armies back to the rivers and then the north. Exchange of hostages sufficient to guarantee good behavior until the ink dries. I will leave with you 3 names from among my lords, and you will give me 3 from among yours, not children. We will exchange coin to make reparations to the small folk of the tracts that have been burned. We will open trade again. We will write these things, and we will speak them in the sight of men, and we will bind them with oaths that mean something to those who intend to keep them. And if I refuse?" she asked again, as if by saying it twice she could squeeze something different from the word. "Then the boy dies," said the small man, and the boy started, and for the first time showed awareness that this talk had anything to do with him. "Not by his hand," the hand added, "but he will die nonetheless." He looked at the young man. "You can say that aloud if it helps." "I did not come to kill a boy," the young man said. "Do not force me to learn that skill." For a time there was only the sound of breath and the occasional distant cry of a gull and the weight of stones being themselves. The queen's hand went to her rings and toyed with them. She had learned long ago how long to toy with rings before a man believed that her mind had wandered and she could slip a small thing under his guard. It did not work here. The small man watched her hand and allowed a small part of himself to remember a woman with hair like spilled ink who had toyed with her rings for pleasure rather than calculation. That memory made him kind for the span of a heartbeat. Then he set it aside and resumed his work. "We will draft something," he said. "We will sign nothing until the noon of 2 days hence. We will hold the boy until—" "You will not talk about me as if I were absent," the boy king said. "I could have you all whipped." "You could," said the small man, "but you will not. You will not because the man who would do it for you is standing 2 paces to your left and is debating whether his loyalty is better spent on your mother's fear or on his own expectation of the future. Quiet, nephew." The queen's nostrils flared. She despised him for his clarity as much as for his insolence. But she said, "Right," and when she said it she sent in that single syllable a pair of contradictory messages. One to the world that said she commanded all, and one to herself that admitted the world does as it pleases. So they wrote. The small man's clerk came and wrote, and the words looked so pale and frail set against the weight of the day that the young man had to steady himself to continue speaking them. He thought of the men who were his, spread through the city like seeds in an uncertain wind, and he measured out his requests with that in mind, understanding that men at their posts are like candles left on a sill. The longer they burn, the more likely the city's draft will snuff them. He considered the old knight, waiting with iron patience for one shout that would bring him to the gate. He kept his voice even as he knew that somewhere, beyond the horizon of this table, a great lord in his father's colors was being told a thing that would demand from him either a laugh or a blow. Hours passed as days do, and they are very full. The sun declined. Bywater's men remained as statues. The fish carts went on to kitchens and then to pans. The girls who had sung the filthy song were cuffed again by someone different for an infraction they had not known existed. In the street of silk, a woman with tired eyes counted out coin into a tired palm and wondered if she had miscounted, then counted again. In the Mudgate barracks, dice rolled and men told lies about who had kissed whom, and in the telling consoled themselves that kissing was still a thing that could happen in the world. When at last the small man put down his seal and wiped a bead of wax on the table's marred surface, he felt as unsteady as he had felt the first time he had stood up too quickly after a fever. He met the young man's eyes and did not look away. In that mutual gaze was the weird intimacy of men who might one day have to kill each other. "You will keep your promises?" the small man said. "I intend to," said the young man. "Intention matters less to you than it does to me, I know. But it matters to me. It matters to me," the small man said in a tone that made the queen's head turn. "But I do not confuse it with a guarantee. I do not offer it as one," said the young man. "There are no guarantees after we bury fathers." They parted with formalities that would later be repeated in halls by men who had not been present and embellished by men who had. The boy king went into the hands of the Blackfish and a dozen guards who would have died for less cause, and some who had expected to die for more and had made a sort of peace with the discrepancy. The girl returned to the rooms where she had found the dawn, and she sat in the beeswax light and felt the first uncontested breath she had taken in months move through her chest. She had thought so often of how leaving would feel that when it came she could not recognize it. The world did not right itself. It did not become the North. It became something else entirely, and she realized then with a small shock that one does not get homesickness like a fever and then recover from it once cured. One carries it forever like a scar under the hair, an itch that sometimes wakes you. Outside, the city considered the matter and began to make of it a story suitable for telling. It was not simple. No city stories are simple because cities are deposits of all the places their people had come from, and each brings its own rules for what makes a good tale. The baker's apprentices decided the wolf had held the young man on his horse when he would have fallen. The women in the laundries said the queen had wept, and this was proof of her humanity or else proof of her weakness. The men at the mud gate decided the fish had been a trick and then decided it was not a trick but a sign. In Flea Bottom, children put weeds through the slats of their window shutters the way rural children hang rushes on doorposts when they hear a rumor of plague, and they slept that night with the taste of weeds on their tongues and had strange dreams of snow and deep water and tables piled with meat. News flies faster than birds when it has somewhere to roost. Far to the west, the old lord with a lion for his device took a cup of watered wine and sipped and said exactly nothing for a long time. Then he put down the cup in its exact place and took up a pen and wrote a letter and then wrote another and then called for a third sheet and began to write a different sort of letter entirely. The sort that does not travel by raven because ravens can be shot down. The sort that goes in a man's chest and is spoken with his mouth to the men who must hear it. He did not raise his voice. He never did. The men who listened leaned in to hear, which is an older trick than any other in a politician's bag. He did not show rage. Raging is for men who wish to be seen to rage. He made a calculation that felt to him like a prayer because prayer is another word for that which one does in the quiet to prepare for the unavoidable. In the city, the small man slept briefly and badly in a chair with a book on his chest. A maid found him in the gray hour before dawn and put a blanket over his knees without waking him, and she went out and stood in the corridor and cried a little for no reason she could explain to herself without using a dozen reasons she wouldn't believe in the morning. The young man walked the perimeter of the little court where his men had made a place for him to sit on a plain stool, and he sat and took the boy king's measure as one would a young stallion, a creature made of blood and bone and ignorance. He spoke to him without insult and without gentleness. He talked of weather and of a horse breed from the north and waited for the boy to find some footing that wasn't swagger. When the boy did not, the young man did not push. He had learned that men come to themselves by paths that cannot be forced, and that forcing breaks more than it builds. He called for bread and cheese and bacon and broke the bread himself and passed it, and when the boy chose the largest portion thoughtlessly, the young man nodded to the man beside the boy to see that the next time the portion he would reach for first would be smaller. Some lessons one has to have taught to one's hand before they can be learned by one's head. In the keep, the queen sat alone for the span of an hour and was not observed. Alone, she let her face, so controlled, so schooled, relax into something nearly childlike in its fatigue. Then she took up a glass and filled it and emptied it and filled it again, and when she had done she stood, put away the glass, smoothed her gown and put on her face. It is not nothing what a woman can do by putting on her face. In the morning the writing began again. There were more clauses, and the small man insisted upon the ones that did not sound like poetry because those are the ones that matter when men later say that a phrase meant this or that. Words like shall and hereafter and remit. There was talk of the riverlands as being inhabiting themselves, of the north as an ancient thing that must not be constrained by maps drawn since a certain winter. There were promises of tribute in the form of goods rather than coin for a set number of years to ease the insult. The queen balked at the number. The young man lowered his gaze and raised the number by a fraction. It was a concession he could afford, and he gave it with a clean hand because sometimes negotiating like a merchant saves lives better than negotiating like a lord. He remembered then a story his mother had told him as a boy at winter, in the room with stone you had to warm with your own breath if you wished to feel it, about kings who had knelt to men who were not kings because that was the price of keeping their people whole. He had loved those stories then because they were about kings. He loved them now because they were about keeping people whole. Half a day later, when all that could be written for now had been written, when all the words that could be arrayed in orderly web to restrain the chaos of men's wills had been arrayed, he went out into the city again. He did not ride his horse. He walked. He put his hand to the rough of stones. He walked by a shoemaker's shop and watched the man tap nails into saws with a tap that sounded like a kind of punctuation. He saw a boy carrying a basket of figs he had stolen. The boy looked clever and hopeful and doomed in a way that gouged his chest more than any blade had. He saw 3 girls with water pitchers and a way of arranging their shoulders together that made them into one creature with 6 legs and 3 heads. He saw 2 men carrying a scaffold and a pig that squealed with offended dignity. He saw a priest pinched by the sun. He saw the river and its old hunger to be the thing that bore ships to places where men thought they would be made new. And he thought of the north and of snow underfoot and of the name of the boy he had once been. At the edge of the quay, a man who had been told to expect nothing until he was told opened his palm and showed 1 small blue stone. Another man, present by accident, saw the blue stone and thought of the sea and of a girl he had known whose eyes had been that color. And he smiled and then went on not knowing he had just watched news change hands. If anyone had asked him later, the small man would have said he had known all along that this would not be the end of war. There are no ends to things any more than there are beginnings. There are only heavy doors between rooms and the drafts that pass under them. But he would also have said that there are days when one can make the passage less costly. He closed the day's books and folded his hands, and by candlelight wrote 1 letter he would sign, and 1 he would not, and 1 he would burn after reading. He sat a long time with the smoke and thought of his brother and their father and then stopped thinking of them because there are thoughts one must ration. He went out at last and, walking between 2 guards who had learned to walk so that their boot heels spoke in unison, he found the girl going the other way with her chaperone, and the 2 exchanged a look that acknowledged one another as the sort of people who, having seen their lives tried on in front of them, will approach the future with an economy of falseness. Night came and sat its weight upon the roofs. The taverns filled. Men told the day in different words. Women told the day in other words. A candle guttered and was replaced. A thief found a rich man and was kind to him because he was newly in love and wanted the world to know that his love made him nearly holy. In the stables, a boy sang a song about the young wolf that had traveled fast down roads, and the old groom cuffed him and said, "Do not sing out of turn," and then sang a bar of it himself under his breath, his voice all gravel, because he had known a wolf once and had liked it. On the walls, the men with crossbows leaned and counted stars. One said, "Have you ever seen snow?" The other said, "Once." It did not suit. In his tent, pitched in a courtyard older than the first stones of the Red Keep, the young man set his palm on the wolf's broad head, and the wolf sighed and pressed its head more hard into that hand, and in that communion was a respite that the day could not argue with. The boy king, in another room, lay awake and learned the uncomfortable lesson that beds are only beds and not charms of protection. The queen dreamed of a wreath of flowers placed on her head by hands she could not see, and in the dream the flowers had thorns that could not be removed, but when she put her hand to her hair upon waking her scalp was smooth and unmarked, and this enraged her in a way that reminded her of childhood. Far from the city, in a tent of striped silk that smelled of horses and the men who love horses more than their own children, men poured wine and struck off jokes that burned one another pleasantly like a barber's crisping iron. They spoke of what a boy had done on steps he had not been invited to climb, and polished the story until their laughter made it less sharp. A lord with a hawk's eyes that had not yet gone cloudy said the boy's father had been too stiff to do such a thing and that stiffness had killed him. Another lord said stiffness can hold a dam, and the hawk-eyed man conceded with that flick of shoulder that is the knight's version of humility. They plotted. They planned. The ink dried or did not. The ravens flew. The sea went on being its old indifferent self. The next morning the city woke into its altered version of itself and began to learn new habits. Habit is how one survives the uncatalogued. Shopkeepers learned that soldiers in wolf-twine badges paid for bread and looked you in the eye while they did it. Some of the shopkeepers liked that and some did not. At the barracks, a young man from the Riverlands addressed a goldcloak who had made a blustering remark and used the exact number of words required to make a man measure himself and find himself lacking. At the Sept, a woman who had believed herself an enemy to the cause that had taken the city hung a strip of cloth in a particular shade of blue from a peg behind the altar because it reminded her of a ribbon her daughter had once worn, and grief will make a votary of anyone. Halfway to noon, the old knight with the fish took the boy king out to walk in the yard. The boy stumbled, and the old knight did not reach to steady him. The boy looked up, outraged. The old knight said, "We do not help a man stand by holding him up. We help him stand by pointing out the ground." The boy stared at him longer than he had ever stared at any man who spoke to him in a way he did not like. He did not reply. The wolf watched, tongue-lolling, amused. Terms were read. Scribes coughed and shook sand from the page onto the table and blew softly to dry. Men stood and listened because standing is what one does on such days, and because if you sit you will feel your belly complain. The queen kept her head lifted and learned. Again, the dirty dignity of letting things be done to you for a higher thing than pride. The small man measured the distance between disaster and this, whatever this was, and reckoned himself fortunate. The young man did not allow himself to look toward the street where he knew a girl with red hair might be looking. He kept his face turned to the table and to the men and to the matters that would buy safety like grain in a lean season. Before dusk, the first ravens with seals carrying the news of the pact flew toward castles that had already heard rumors. Men in those castles put down knives and cups to catch the birds. Women set down their embroidery. Children were told to be silent and then told to go on shouting when their silence proved distracting. In one such hall, a man older than the hills and as vain as anyone with less excuse opened a letter and read it and said one very simple word that made his sons and grandsons look at one another and begin, each of them, immediately to calculate what this meant for his interests. In another such place, a boy newly made lord by the death of 3 uncles read the words and felt his heart kick like a colt and began to pace. And his aunt laughed at him and loved him and told him to sit and then brought him ale because sweat had sprung under his hair. In still another, a woman tall and ungirlish sat before her fire while a knight with a sad jaw polished a sword and tried not to watch the way the light fell on her face. She had chosen her road and would not be turned by news, and that was stubbornness and glory both. The knight would be among the first to learn that sometimes when a storm one expected passes, the storm one receives is worse. He would handle it with his habitual, heartbreaking grace. At midnight, in a part of the city where trumpets do not carry and where men tell each other truths so blunt they are like hammers. Truths like "this is bread," "this is a knife," "this is my hand," "this is not my hand," "this is yours." The young man sat beside the wolf and listened to the river. He could not tell what kind of future this was. He only knew he had moved the pieces as far as his arms could reach without breaking them and had put into the world a statement of what he hoped men could be coaxed to become, and now the world would submit its counterproposal. He thought of a wedding once promised and now perhaps not, of a bridge he had crossed and might never cross again, of a name he had worn and now a new name others would put on him, be it king or traitor or boy. He closed his eyes and slept sitting up and dreamed of a winter field where the grass made a sound like prayer under his boots. The next day came with another dawn that felt reluctant but could not afford to stay away. Men took down the notices posted overnight by men with ink-stained fingers that proclaimed the articles of peace in letters most of those who looked on could not read. Others read aloud and were paid in bread to do it. There were signatures and promises and the pointing of fingers at maps. The goldcloaks stood with their helmets on and their jaws set. Wolfmen loaded packs and checked girths and mended straps and paid for bacon and said, "Thank you, mistress," like their mothers had taught them if their mothers had been women who believed in saying thank you to those who put food in your hand. The queen oversaw the movement of this and that with the dignity of a master of a house, ensuring the furniture went through the door upright. The small man drank wine water twice and said to anyone who would listen that he was not God and did not pretend to be, which made those who heard him insist privately that he was more like God than many who had said otherwise. There were, of course, men for whom peace was a poor meal. They prowled the edges of it, teeth unsatisfied, and they plotted the interruption. In a tavern near the Street of Steel, a man with a scar that bent one half of his mouth arranged to meet at a certain time down by the river with men who had been paid in foreign coin to throw off their cloaks at a signal. The wolf smelled them and disliked them and communicated its dislike to its man by a delicate movement of shoulder. The man nodded once and altered a watch. That change would save 3 lives and doom 2. The world counts such things with a peculiar balance. The boy king said something unwise to the old knight, and the old knight simply looked at him in a way that made the boy hear his own words with an adult's ears for the first time. He came to the boy again later with a wooden sword and said, "Hold it," and put his own hand over the boy's when he saw how he held it. And the boy did not sleep that night for thinking of the weight that had pressed his hand, and for the first time in his life his thoughts of a sword were not of glory but of the simple labor of not dropping it. He would forget that lesson often and learn it again. In the north, a woman who had taught that boy on the bay to wash his ears and to say his name without mumbling watched the snow fall and wondered why the day felt easier in her hands. She could not say what thread had loosened. She only knew that when she poured water that morning it did not resist the pitcher as much as most mornings did. She looked toward the south and said none of the names of her children because there are charms too expensive to spend before one must. That night, when the last of the parchments had been sanded and the last of the seals pressed and cooled, when the first cart had rolled out of the shadow of the red Keeps Hill under a sky where stars had pried apart the fog, the young man went to the river once more. The wolf went at his heel. The water made its old, patient sound. He stood and thought there would be other days, and some of them would be worse than this and some better, and that he might have avoided one kind of death in exchange for continuations of many kinds of life, and he could live with that. He turned at last and looked at the city as if he were taking a portrait of it to carry with him. Somewhere on the far side of that city, a man with a pointed beard wrote a letter to a family whose name had traded often enough with his own that it now sounded a little like his when shouted in markets. He sealed it in red wax, then broke the seal, then sealed it again with black, then broke that one, then took a deep breath and sealed it with no wax at all, tying it instead with string and letting that be its bond. He had begun to learn something about the way words behaved when tied. The young man returned to his tent. He slept, and by morning the men were formed by companies along the streets, each company a careful bundle of discipline. They began their march as a ship begins to lean into a current. The city watched them go with relief so keen it could be confused with regret. The small man stood on the wall and watched them go and thought of the next thing and the next, and he did not allow himself to think of what might have been avoided if all the men at all the tables in his life had been both just and intelligent, because that way lies madness. He smiled, not because there was anything to smile about yet, but because smiling when you are watched is part of the work, and then he went inside to write 5 more letters with different tones to the 5 different men who would require 5 different tones to do what the city required of them to keep its skin intact. On the 3rd day the young man crossed the river yard at dawn, and the girl was waiting with a bundle wrapped in linen and tied with cord, and she offered him the bundle without a word. It held bread and a piece of cheese and a packet of herbs a northern woman had once taught her to strew at the threshold for luck, but which in the south were used to scent bathwater. The young man took it and thought, "I will bring you home." The girl thought, "I will learn how to be in the world without a rope around my wrist." The wolf thought of bones and winter. They left the city with bells. Not the bells of mockery, nor the bells of triumph, but bells that sounded like an old house closing its door gently behind a guest who has not been asked to stay the night but is not being thrown out either. And after they had gone, after the gates had swung back into place and the last of the dust had settled, the city rustled and resettled itself, the way women settle a set of skirts with one good shake and a pat. It would tell this story now. It would tell it often. In the telling, men would change what small men had said and what queens had thought and who had stood where. The city would become its own poet. But for a little, just a little, in the space before the story ossified into uses, there was the truth. That a boy had ridden into the mouth of a thing that eats kings and had come out again holding the same values he had gone in with. That is not nothing. It is not everything, but it is not nothing. And far off, the old lord with the lion upon his table leaned back in his chair and let the candlelight paint his knuckles gold and thought about roads and bridges and food and fear. He sent out his men like hands into the dark, and the dark came back with answers that were both worse and better than he had hoped. And he folded those answers into the scheme he was making moment by careful moment. In the east, a girl with white hair looked at a sea she had not crossed and felt the wind change. In the winter country, something old turned over in its sleep. In the Riverlands, a man with long fingers counted the cost of another man's sudden compassion. In a small house at the edge of the Kingswood, the boy who had found the cough in the lock told his mother there would be ducks, and she laughed and cried and called him a fool and kissed his hair and asked him who would be fool enough to give her a duck. The morning after that, the world moved on. It moved with a slowness that invited someone to mistake it for peace. It moved with a speed that terrified anyone who had learned that a thing set in motion will not be stopped by mere admonition. The city made new habits. The road grew the shape of an army. The girl watched the sky. The small man sharpened his wit. The queen tended her garden of instruments. The old lord tightened his belt one notch. The wolf slept and dreamed of running over drifts that could bear its weight without groaning. And the young man, between judgments and jokes, between bread and orders, between visions of snow and sights of brick, kept walking, kept listening, kept placing his hand on the load-bearing edges of each moment and feeling for the creak that meant he could push a little more, and not crack the joist. What he had started could end a war, or else it could make a different one, slower and perhaps more survivable for those to come after him. He would live with that unknowable, because the world does not give any man the courtesy of certainty. It gives only mornings like this and wolves, and the sound of bells that cannot be told to untoll themselves once rung. The road received them as if it had been waiting all along, its long gray back running under the ribs of the day, line after line of boot and hoof and will wearing the dust to a finer powder that tasted of chalk when it touched the tongues of men who shouted orders or sang to keep their steps. The king's road was like any old habit, a thing taught to bear weight and not complain, and it took this new procession as it had taken so many others, grumbling only in the places where floods had undermined the stones, giving way with a reluctant courtesy at culverts whose mouths had caved. The morning heat came early, sly as a pickpocket, sliding fingers into the gaps between plates and under collars and along scalps. The smell of leather and iron and horse writ slow, and where the road lifted and fell in its old, patient ripples, the caravan rose and sank like breath. Men who had slept in courtyards woke to hedges and open field, and the city's smell thinned behind them until it became a story they had told so often to themselves they could not recall its beginning. Gray wind trotted with the careless economy of the truly strong, his tongue suspended in the cool part of his pant, his flank streaked with dust from rolling in a patch that had pleased him. The boy in the middle of it, king of the city one day, guest hostage the next, rode on a gelding so soft-footed that he could not make it announce him with the clatter he desired. The black fish kept a step behind and to the left, the angle a man takes when he means to engage without inviting. He had stripped down to a hauberk and a plain surcoat, and his visor hung from his saddle like an old habit he'd meant to discard and could not. Robb did as he had decided he would do. He rode near enough to see and hear, far enough to be a weather rather than a wall. He let others attend to the boy's reins and to the boy's pride and to the boy's small failures of seat and hand upon the neck, and he concerned himself with the line's flow, with the rhythm of carts and step, with the 100 small adjustments a long body must make to avoid tripping over its own feet. He visited companies as they moved and then moved ahead of him. He said little and not for lack of words. There is a music to command that uses silence as its drum. On the first day he had the boy walked on his own feet for an hour at noon while the sun was the sort of honest that makes men confess to watering the beer. He did not announce it. He dismounted and put his hand to the horse's shoulder and said, "Let him breathe." And the black fish dismounted without question and took the boy's bridle and handed it to a lad and began to walk, and that was the end of it. Joffrey burned like a candle for the first quarter hour and then smoldered, and in the last 20 minutes kept a fixed smile on his face with such determination that one might have mistaken it for courage. Robb allowed himself one glance and no more. He had learned that a boy under the eye is a boy who will break either toward performing or toward hide, and both were wrong for this moment. They made camp an hour before dusk beside the half-ruin of a toll house whose square bottom had been built for permanence and whose upper story carried the memory of a fire with the same stubbornness an old limb carries the weather. The men fell to their known work, and in the midst of it, the cadence of the day shifted with an ease that would have made any court poet say there was harmony in it. Fires bit, horses blew, leathers creaked circumspectly. Men's voices dropped from command to the domestic talk that reminds the body it will be warmed and fed. The boy stood where the black fish put him and watched. He did not know where to put his hands when men were working. He tried them folded, tried them on his hips, tried them behind his back, and then let them dangle until he remembered someone had once told him a king's hands must never dangle, and he tucked them into his belt and did not release them again for a quarter hour. Gray wind tilted his head and sniffed the boy's boots. The boy flinched and then did not, and a muscle in his cheek jumped and then was still. The wolf's eyes were the color of old river stones. The boy saw himself in them only as a pale smear of movement. "Come," the black fish said at last, when the camp had set its bones and begun to lay meat upon them. He took the boy in the direction of the picket line. They walked slow and did not speak. In the manner of old men and wolves, the old knight let silence do an hour's work in the space of 5 minutes. At the picket a gelding shied and felt himself checked with a hand that had never yet learned to be steady. The old knight put his thumb between the horse's lips and rubbed the gum, and the horse lowered its head, ashamed of himself, and breathed that great, secret breath horses keep for their most intimate friends. "You see," said the old knight. "What?" said the boy. "You see," the old knight repeated, and stepped into the tally of legs and ropes with a confidence that reminded the animals of an elder stallion. He took up a brush and drew it in long, unhurried strokes along a chestnut neck. "You will take the other brush," he said over his shoulder. "I am not a groom," the boy said. "You are a boy with a horse," the knight said, which was not an answer, and the boy stood too long and then stepped in. Awkward at first with the stiffness of a man fearing laughter. None came. Men at the picket minded their own horses and their own souls. The boy tried to hold the brush as he had seen someone do once. The horse rolled, ed an eye and twitched an ear and then submitted. The boy made a face to express distaste. The black fish neither helped nor mocked. He kept at his own work and talked, not as men talk to boys to fill their ears with moralities, but as men talk to horses when they mean to accompany. "Down the line," he said. "You will feel where the hair turns. Follow that. Do not fight it. The wind drove it there. The nature of the beast keeps it there. If you insist on your way, you will make knots, and knots look like care to men who do not know horses, but every horse knows the lie you've made of him. A king who wishes everyone to see his care may instruct that every beast be brushed against the hair, and then you will have men standing around a yard full of shining lies. Brush with the hair." The boy kept his teeth together while he made his strokes. No one said his name. When the chestnut snorted and squared his feet and set his head low and to one side, as horses do when they feel the friend in a hand on their neck, the boy's mouth loosened. Not a smile, not relief, only a release of something cut too tight earlier in the day. At the end of the row, the old knight took both brushes and knocked the dust from them and handed one back. "You will do the second row before you eat," he said. "Not because you must, but because you should. It is astonishing how much of a life is lived in the space between must and should." The boy looked as if he might throw the brush onto the ground and say a thing he would regret. He did not. He stepped into the second row and lifted his hand once he had swallowed, and his arm ached by the center of the line, and when he finished the last gelding shook and stamped as if to say a proper apology had been made. Robb watched all this from across the yard and kept his expression the blank of a man explaining pay. The black fish saw him not seeing and did his own not seeing in return. The work of living teaches men who wish to be decent how to be respectful at a distance, which is harder than being gentle up close. Supper was brown stew and a slab of bread that had begun to taste of sackcloth from hanging too long in a ready state. The cooks were tired of feeding an army that would not stay fed. The boy king ate as boys do when they have worked their arm until it shakes. He took the biggest portion thoughtlessly and did not look up to see whether anyone cared. The blackfish looked, and Robb did, and the man on the boy's left, a good soldier of no particular family, took the smallest without show. Lesson taught. The boy did not notice. Not every piece of instruction must bear fruit before dawn. Sansa ate by a fire near the quartermaster's table, ringed in a safety that tasted thin after the relentless safety of the Red Keep. She had expected the world to feel wider the moment she stepped out of the city's shadow. It did not. The camp was a kind of city made of canvas and quiet bargains and paths beaten by feet that have not had time to become streets. She found that she could lose herself in it easily enough, turn down an aisle between wagons and find herself in a little square where men mended straps and no one looked up at her, because in a camp the order of looking is carefully rationed. Look too often and someone will think you are asking for something. She was not asking for anything. That was her oddness now. For so long her want had been a taut rope. Escape, a letter, a glance from someone who could undo the last knot binding her day to the next. But the knot had been cut by a stranger's hand and a familiar name, and wanting had emptied out of her like water from a tipped pitcher. She sat by the fire and went about the business of being a person, soup, bread, a mouthful of something that was meant to be pickled cabbage and was a memory of that. A woman with a nose like a kind knife asked if she wished for more, and she said no and was believed. A little while later, when the singing began somewhere toward the back of the line, men who could not leave a day unechoed by sound, she stood and walked to the edge of the light. Gray Wind found her, as he found everyone who mattered to his man, with an ease that suggested the day bent to his preferences rather than the other way around. He came up and stood beside her and did not lean, only let his warmth become a fact on her left. The space was too public to put her hand to his ruff. She contented herself with the fact of him. Robb stepped into the circle's half-light with the modesty of a man not accustomed to women appreciating his entry. He came on the work business of asking after supplies and checking the cook's tally with the quartermaster and making a joke that cost him nothing and bought the quartermaster the sense that his labor was seen. Then he turned and found Sansa in the manner of men who intend not to surprise a nervous creature. He kept his hands visible and his voice low. "Lady," he said. She dipped a little without thinking, a curtsy that was more acknowledgement than submission, and then drew herself up as if she had remembered that her back was hers to straighten. "Your Grace," she said, with a ghost of a smile that could be mistaken for embarrassment and could also be mistaken for courage if one were predisposed to see it. "We will send riders ahead," he said, and only when he said it did she realize she had been thinking as if Winterfell would arrive to her rather than she to it. "At the crossings there will be men with sharp elbows. We'll ease that. The first day only a hard pace. Then I mean to give the men their breath. The boy..." He glanced over, where Joffrey sat with a cup in his hand too large for him, his face lit by fire and his mouth set. "The boy will keep up. He is being schooled today by a better school than I had at his age." "Was he?" she asked. "Was it so hard to learn to be what you are?" Robb looked down at his hands, which were rougher than they had been when he left Winterfell and T had not lost their young. "I keep learning and then forgetting and then learning again," he said, and for a second there was such a nakedness to his voice that she looked away out of respect, as one looks away when a man undresses to show a wound. "If the gods are kind, they will stop giving me lessons. But there is little evidence that they favor kindness over patience." "You make him brush horses," she said. "The horses demand brushing," he said. "He is near them. The rest follows." They stood in the warmth of the wolf without speaking for a time that might have been a prayer. He asked if she had everything she needed and then stopped himself from asking if she wanted for anything, because wanting was a luxury and he would not insult her. She thanked him. He bowed and went away to become again the weather of the camp. The presence one accounts for when tying down a tent. The gust felt at the edge of a talking man's hat brim. Behind them in the dark another sort of weather moved. Men who wear cloaks well wear them because they have learned the trick of becoming breeze rather than wall. They slid along hedges and put their feet where the grass grew flat, not from cunning but from the old economy of not wasting muscles on lifting where one could instead lay the foot and roll it. Their coin had changed hands 3 times that day, and each time it had been counted by a woman whose thumbs smelled of resin and refuse and caution. The man who led them, he had no claim to be a leader except for the fact he was willing to tell the others when to do something wrong and did not mind being blamed afterward. had been shown the place by a boy who would be thanked in money that did not spend as easily as he had been promised. They arranged themselves like a paragraph meant to be read one way but able to be read another. On the ridge above the camp, a small man not in armor sat with his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands and listened to the knight's conversation in his own dry way. Tyrion Lannister had discovered a pleasure in long travel he had not anticipated. The way a night emptied of walls and furniture and people meant to flatter could be filled with the arguments of insects and the opinions of frogs. He had been given a tent because small men in positions of authority are often gifted with tents as if canvas were a sort of proof, but he liked better the little stool and the quiet and the balancing of a cup on the back of one boot while he thought. Bronn had taken himself off to play at dice not because he was addicted to it, but because men who carry coin for you are better anchored to you when they think you will do them the favor of lifting them from their boredom. Tyrion did not mind. He thought better in absence. He had watched the boy brush the horses and had considered whether he had ever brushed a horse. He tried to conjure evidence. His mind produced only a chorus of grooms shaking their heads at the notion. He had sat with Sansa. No, he had not sat. He had walked as far as was proper beside her in the keep's long, narrow corridors and had said a thing or two. That had to count for something. He had sent for what he could to ease a girl's leaving, as if an extra pair of stockings and a comb with teeth set not too close could make a difference. He had overseen ink and wax and the proper arrangement of lies into a shape that would protect men's bodies. He had done many things. He did not know if any of them would be the thing that kept the next day from becoming an argument with spears. He thought about the chain. He always thought about the chain. It had been a good idea. He had nearly convinced himself he had had the idea before the day required it of him. The river deserves iron, he thought, and then turned his mind deliberately from the river to the dry ground of the road and the sound of a sapper snoring like a man who had once been contented and could not remember the trick by day. He heard a bird give a soft, wrong cry and felt the small hairs along his arm lift as if called. He set down the cup and did not reach for the dagger at his hip. He seldom did the thing a sensible man would do first. He looked for Bronn, and not seeing the Sellsword's shape in any of the near circles of firelight, he marked 3 gaps in the hedgerow where gaps had not been earlier. Then he did the sensible thing and stood and began to walk as if to piss, and because he was a man who'd had a belt made to suit him, he was sure he could have accomplished that if required. In passing, he put his hand briefly on the shoulder of a man whose business it was to set the watch and whose talent was to look as if he were not the sort of man one would choose to set the watch. The man looked up without moving his head. Tyrion nodded toward the hedge as if admiring its health. The man's eyes flicked once and returned to their idle position. He coughed. Somewhere to the left, the cough was answered by another that did not quite match it, and the watchman's hand became heavy on his knee, the signal he had devised for the boy who lay behind him in the grass with a bow positioned and an arrow notched but not drawn. 4 of the men in cloaks slid into the space between tent and wagon and became, briefly, the shape of that space. One put his hand on the rim of the cart and felt his palm meet resin and then hair. Horsehair braided through a rope, still tacky from tar. He did not like how the world's small facts named him amateur. He went on anyway because coin has a way of calling a man forward against his judgment. He put his foot down and found that the ground had been swept, and he disliked that as well. Camp men in a hurry do not sweep, not in that particular pattern, not there. And he had time to think all this before he stepped on the wrong nothing at the wrong moment, and the boy in the grass let go his breath and the arrow caught the man under the collar of his cloak where the fabric had been cut to save the tiara. Ubble of making a proper slit. The thud his body made was the thud of an argument ended. The other 3 reacted like brothers and not like professionals. Each turned his head toward the noise instead of away toward the work. And in that moment the second arrow took the one with a scar under his eye, and the third man panicked properly and rushed and met a strap he did not see and fell. And when he fell he found a boot at his neck wearing a man above it whose method had been developed over a long season of not losing. After, Tyrion moved himself in a way that suggested he had woken from a particularly restful sleep and had found himself taking a little air. He stood beside the man with the boot and looked down at the failure there. The man looked at him with the steady, unsurprised gaze of a beast pulled from a snare before starve. He said nothing and waited for the price to be spoken. It was spoken not in coin but in questions. And when those questions came not with pain but with an accountant's patience, the man surrendered the shape of what he knew. He had been paid. He had been shown a map of the camp so careful it had made him blush. He had been told the signal would come in the form of a single cough. He had laughed that off until he heard the cough. Foreign coin. The man nodded. He looked relieved. He should have. Confession is always easier to the confessor than to the men who have to figure out where to file it. Tywin rubbed at one temple and arranged the known pieces in his mind and was not pleased with the picture they made. In the morning he told the boy nothing. He had burned in all the moment he needed. The black fish said, "We will run more pickets farther from the line. We will sleep hard under our arms for a day." "We need not sleep hard," Tywin said. "We need sleep cleverly. Bywater." He had ridden with them only the first day and would turn back on the second, to ensure the city's spine was not bent by the mere absence of the man who had made it straight. Listened and asked 2 questions that were the sort men ask when they intend the matter to improve. They changed the next camp as one changes a dance step to suit the fiddler reading of the room. The only man who noticed and objected was one who disliked sleeping with his feet toward the fire. He believed it bad luck. The black fish told him that if the gods needed to find his head that night, they would do it without assistance, and the man laughed and slept with his feet toward the fire and did not die. As the line moved north with its own weather, another weather gathered behind, in rooms where sun came in through carved stone like old lace. Cersei Lannister poured wine and no water into it and drank, not because she desired its taste or wished to be drunk, but because the burn at the back of her throat felt like proof of a world that could still be made to hurt on command. Pain that comes when one calls for it is its own kind of comfort. She had slept in a bed that smelled of fear that night. Fear stains linen worse than blood, and she had sent the linens down and told them to be boiled, and when they came back she could still taste it in the air. She had slapped a girl whose crime had been obedience without grace. She had told her brother's dwarf to do the impossible, and he had done the merely difficult, and she hated him for his limits as well as for his successes. She had let the small man write a compact to bind her hands because there had been no choice that did not bind them, and then she had gone to the window and watched the men with the wolf badges move, and she had placed her hand on the sill and imagined pushing hard enough to crack the stone. Pycelle had appeared like a relic taken down and dusted, all owl eyes and thoughts in that order that looks like dutiful concern until one hears him try to rank his duties. "Grace," he intoned, as if the sound of the word might call the thing. We must survive," she said. "Write what you like to your friends about what must. I will do it." She had sent him away and then sent him for her son. Tommen came and put his soft hand in hers and tried to be brave because he loved her, and that did worse for her insides than any grief. She had kissed his hair and told him a story about when he was small that made him laugh with a hiccup, and she had thought of the boy on the road in the hands of old men and wolves, and she had set her jaw like a door bar. She had sent for Lancel because she had discovered he could be used like a small blade. Paltry metal but very sharp, and she liked blades. She had spoken to him in a voice that would have made a saint sin and had told him to go and stand at a certain door and listen for a certain name. And when he had brought her back the wrong name she had struck him and then laughed and said it was not he struck, it was the day. And he had looked at her like a dog that has been trained to receive cruelty as a form of love. She detested that. She detested herself for needing him. She had tried to write to her father. What she penned first was a complaint against the world disguised as counsel. She tore it. What she penned next was coherent and cruel and would have suited a general. She tore that as well. What she sent was not what she thought, and she thanked no god for the restraint. The raven flew with fewer words than contained her rage. It would do. Peter Baelish took her coin and others and laughed at them both in his sleeve. He walked through the halls with the assured drift of a man who has taught himself to be a handsome rumor, and he spoke to 2 men who could not resist speaking to him. He gave one of them information and the other a promise, and he dipped into his pocket for a nut to crack between his teeth and discovered he had cracked the last of them before dawn. And this pleased him because he liked to think of himself as a man who had eaten all that had been set before him before the tables had been art. He wrote a letter that said nothing in a way that would cause the recipient to imagine everything. He stood at a window and thought of a rose on a banner, then of a boy in pearl and gold, then of another boy with softer eyes, and then of how men arrange their games once they have acquired children. Varys listened. He listened in rooms that had no names and in alleys that wore their braids of garlic like necklets, and in the rafters of a loft where a boy with one ear God had failed to complete told him the shape of a story. A man had told him about a sack of coin paid to a man who did not live long enough to take the coin home. He listened to women who did laundry for men whose hands were never clean. He listened to the river make its heavy argument against boats. He listened to the small man think behind a locked door. He listened to the queen not think at all, which is to say he watched her drink. He stored all these sounds the way a mouse stores grain against its own certainty of winter. He did not like the shape of this moment. He rarely liked the shape of moments. Liking shapes was not his part in the world. Tywin Lannister, on news of the exchange and the ink and the departure, did not rage. He never did. He held court at a table that might have been the back of his own hand for how well he knew its scars. He dismissed a man whose business in his life had been a long lesson in the benefits of dismissal, and he called for maps he could roll and prick with his ring for the sake of the man who had spent an afternoon cutting the cork to receive them. He wrote for Mace Tyrell and did not sign his name with desperation, which would have been as visible as if he had drawn a red border around it. He wrote for a certain priest, not because he believed in the gods but because the sort of men who did were useful when properly placed. He wrote for a lord of the Riverlands whose hatred of the wolf had the clean, uncomplicated line of a boy's hatred of a father's enemy, and he wrote for a woman whose husband was brave and therefore dead. Each letter was tuned to its reader. He had learned early that writing is not speaking. It is the art of placing weight on a page in such a way that a man will hear his own voice reading it and believe the thought his. He set his cup carefully in its circle on the table, where it would not rock. He fretted a fleck of wax that had escaped a seal and found the satisfaction in rolling it between forefinger and thumb until it had warmed and softened into no shape at all. He looked up when Kevin came in and did not bother to disguise his relief that his brother was a man who would bring order into any room he entered. "They will call it peace," Kevin said. "They will," Tywin replied. "Men call a pause peace when they are afraid to move their feet because they feel the ground give. What would you have it called? I would have it called what it is. A hanging bough. It will take the weight of a bird. It will not take a stag." He put his hands together and the tendons stood up like braided rope. "If the boy dies in their hands, we are finished for a season. If he lives and learns nothing, we are finished by inches. If he learns something, we are finished in a new way. And if his learning is ours to shape?" Kevin asked. Tywin turned the wax. He thought of the queen child with her fierce mouth and his particular tenderness for her misplaced and misapplied, and he thought of the smaller one, the one he had insulted at a table once and regretted all his life, and he thought of the boy prince whom he had seen only briefly since the boy had grown long and vain. "We will shape what we can," he said. "We will shape Tommen. He is malleable. He will live long on the notion that kindness is a force. If the Tyrells are to come to court, it will be for him. Find me the measure of their daughter's ambition." "Measures change," said Kevin. "Then find me a way to fix the measure," said Tywin. On the road, the second day's heat backed off its insistence and gave instead a pearly brightness that made the fields to either side look like the underbelly of a fish, all quicksilvering light. The men's steps made a steady drum that soothed and exhausted, in the way of rocks, which are simultaneously stable and not forgiving. The boy king, being 15 and in possession of a spine that had never had to organize itself against anything but furniture and expectation, discovered muscles he had not known he had. He liked the discovery in the way he liked, once, finding a fine thread of gold in a ring he had thought was plain. He disliked it in the way a child dislikes a clever toy that will not obey. He did not complain. That was not a lesson he had learned in the city. Complaining there is a sport and an art. But something about the way men's eyes slid by him when he opened his mouth made him shut it again. It is a special humiliation to discover that your words do not matter, not because they are not bitten with power, but because a day has taken such a shape that there is no place to set them down. He swallowed that humiliation with the plain stew and the homely bread, and if some part of him mistook it for discipline that could be forgiven. Men become better than they are chiefly by accident. On the third day they crossed a slow, brown river whose name men only remember when there is blood in it. The ford was stony and slick and had a trick of pretending to be shallower than it was. Men went out sounding with poles. The black fish took his horse in first without making a speech of it. He never did. The boy went next and found his horse sure and a little nervous, and he found his own body less sure and also a little nervous, and he owed no thanks to any god but physics when they came out the far side uncommonly wet but upright. He began to feel a sour, unfamiliar pride for his own balancing. He did not know where to put that feeling. The men in the line did not clap. Men do not CL. AP for what a man is supposed to do. They camped in an elm stand that night, and the boy looked up at the leaves and saw their undersides turn to show him their paleness when the evening wind came, and he felt, for the first time since he had been taken from his mother's hand, a breath that did not feel shaped for him by other men. It frightened him, then it eased him. He slept and dreamed of a harp string breaking, and when he woke he could not tell whether the sound that had woken him had been his dream or a real thing. It had been a real thing but not a string. Somewhere far to east, a raven had startled. Sansa dreamed too. She dreamed a room with a low ceiling where a candle guttered and the wax fell and would not stay caught by the lip of the cup, and she put her hand out in the dream to catch it. And when she woke, her palm stung where the meat had remembered a burn done years ago when she had tried to make bread in a north kitchen and the bread had been burnt and she had been scolded only gently. She rubbed her hand and smiled because it pleased her now to carry the memory of having been scolded gently. She would carry it like a charm. At Riverrun, where the river makes a shape of defense so clever a child can read it, Catelyn sat with Edmure and with men who had torn their old banners so that they might sew on new borders and new animals and new boasts. She had learned to be patient with men who carried their house's tatters like proud children. Edmure was not yet well recovered of his last wound, and he masked it with that particular kind of cheer a man uses when he is afraid his sister's eyes will go wet with a grief he cannot stand to be the cause of. "He has done it," he said to her in a dozen ways. "He has made a thing of his own in this world, Cat. He has made them order themselves to it." "He has," Catelyn said, and she pressed her lips into a line to keep from saying anything else, because pride, once it leaves the heart and enters the air, becomes too easily a banner for the gods to target. "And have you slept?" "You know I have not," Edmure said, with a gentleness that told her he was tired of being brave in the way men are tired of their best habits. "You know I will not until he is home," she said, and they smiled at one another for naming a thing that could not be. Home is not a place a boy in a crown returns to. It is the thing he carries in his voice if he keeps it. She folded and unfolded the letter that had come, and she counted the clauses as if they were beads. The words were correct. The bones of them were solid. She did not trust bones. Bone is brittle, but she found, against her will and her caution both, a warmth in the small man's phrases, the way he had contrived to put the boy into it as something more than a showpiece. She had not expected that from a man who made his way with words. Sansa's letter had been a separate small thing, folded tight, the letters careful, an apology for what it could not say. It had used only the names that could be used, and so it had spoken like a ghost through a door. Catelyn read it and then set it under the weight of an iron fish so that it would flatten and be easier to keep. She sent out a rider with instructions no more complex than these. Find them as if you were looking for water and bring back what news can be carried without spilling. Roose Bolton stood behind Edmure and Cat and beneath the hanging of the leaping trout, and was so punctilious in his courtesy that men who did not know him could mistake his politeness for care. He said the necessary things. He advised the moderations that would prevent any one man's temper from defining the hall. He asked, in a voice pitched with such restraint it seemed tame, whether they meant to exchange hostages here or send them on, and whether a list had been made. His gaze never lifted long enough to catch anyone's prayer. He excused himself when the talk turned to the disposition of the hostages, claiming he had letters to write to the Dreadfort to ensure its winter stores were laid in. He did have letters. Their words were thin as knives and as sharp, and in one he wrote a phrase that was merely an old proverb about leeches and weather, and in another he wrote a metaphor for peace that would make a man reading it reach for his own blade without knowing why. He sealed them and sent them with men who would not question him because Roose was a man whose quiet turned other men's curiosity to sleep. Theon Greyjoy rode in the rear with men who had their eyes on their own boots. He felt himself a blade that had been left too long in a damp sheath and had begun to rust in places where a man would not see until he put it to work. He joked too loud. He waved his hand at children who watched the line pass. He made himself generous with bread he had been given and had not paid for. Some men loved him for the way he made loudness stand in for luck. Some measured him out of the corner of their eyes and kept their counsel. He had begun to imagine himself in 100 different places, all of them at once and none of them in a seat. He had not yet discovered that wanting to be a seat is the surest way to break one. When he slept, he dreamed of black sails and a woman's laugh that sounded more like a gull's than any laugh had a right to. "Greyjoy," Robb said once when they had paused at a stream to water the horses and to let the men wash the dust from the first layer of their faces, and Theon turned with his grin already sliding into place. "I may send you ahead," Robb said. "Not home. Not yet." He watched the boy's mouth try out 3 different bravados and find that none quite fit this face he had on now. "I need words laid in the north ahead of me, a scatter of them, placed where they will do the most to make way for a homecoming that will not be the old way. Some will not like the shape of this. We will not teach them all from horseback in one pass. We will mouths that their mouths will trust." "I have a mouth," Theon said, and then said, "I have friends," and then said, "I have," and then laughed, frustrated by his inventory. "You have what I need," Robb said, and the boy stood taller under the compliment, and Robb wished for a moment that he could have taken the compliment back and put a hand on Theon's head instead and sent him to fetch wood for the fire. He smiled instead, as men do when they must turn their softest impulses into signals. They made the trident under a sky that had finally surrendered to cloud. The crossing was the sort that makes a man remember how much his life depends not on the heroism of his heart but on the patience of his thigh muscles. The river moved with that firm, indifferent purpose that makes rivers fountains of religion for men who like their gods mechanical. The ford at this place had more stones than any man could count. Some shifted under the foot as if they had their own opinions about men's business. Others were as faithful as an old dog. They took it slow. A cart stuck like a thought the mind cannot finish. The men in the water turned their bodies to it and pushed and pressed and leaned. And then the wheel found the incline on the far side where the mason who had built it had known he was doing a good thing, and it rolled, and men cheered themselves with the sound of their own effort. On the far side, Edmure met them, and they embraced, and Catelyn put her hands on her son's face and saw their lines that had not been there before and pressed her thumbs to the place where tears collect as if to say to them, "Not yet." She brought Sansa to her and held her, and for a moment there were no lords in the world, only women and the way their bodies can make even grief feel like a bed. She did not look at the boy king long. She did not trust herself to see him and not reach. She acknowledged him, barely, with that unassailable courtesy she had learned from a mother who had believed that to deny a man his due was to write your name on his anger. "Your Grace," she said, and the boy's mouth opened to make a speech and then closed because this woman did not hold him the way other men did, as an item for display or as a problem to be arranged. She held him with her eyes like a woman looking at a shirt she must wash with blood on it. He felt small. He hated the feeling. He also felt less tired, and he did not know what to do with that either. The hall at Riverrun was made of quarrels and accords, of trout and steel, of bread and dust and story. It had held weddings and wakes and men's boasts and women's whispers and a few silences too dangerous to touch and too sacred to name. Took this influx like a river takes meltwater, swole and then finding its banks again. Men hung a banner for the boy king because they knew banners mattered more than words to some eyes and because the small man had told them to do it. Tyrion knew what a banner could do to a mind and also what it could not. He saw the cloth and arranged his face and then went to find a table where he could sit with a scribe and turn the mechanical facts of the arrangements into ink that would stand up in a hall 5 months hence when some lord said, "But that is not what was meant," and the clerk could say, "Here, here, it was what was meant." They sat at a long board. Catelyn and Edmure and Brynden and the northern lords arranged themselves in the order their egos demanded, and the small man corrected that order with the efficiency of someone used to arranging pieces on a board that bites if handled rough. The boy king sat at the end, not because he had been given the least place, but because he had been given a place where men could see him without having to adjust themselves around him. Little offices of honor were performed. Large ones were not. It is more courage than most men can muster to forego an opportunity to mock an enemy when the enemy is a child. They managed it because the old knight's eyes could still be felt even when he took himself off to piss. There were arguments. No good compact is written without arguments. A Karstark wanted the blood he had been promised by rage and by custom. Robb listened to him as if to a man explaining the proper way to twist a rope so that it will hold a wet load. He said no. The word fell into the hall like a stone into a quiet pond. The man flared. Robb looked not at his face but at his hands, which were doing a particular little flutter that meant this was habit and not passion. He said no again. Tyrion watched and thought, "Here is a boy learning that the people who love you most will be earliest to tell you you are wrong." Catelyn watched and thought, "Here is a boy learning that love is sometimes the sound of a door being barred." Later, when the table had been cleared and the men had gone off to their corners to count their coin of pride and consider whether they had spent too much or hoarded too little, Sansa and Catelyn sat together with a bowl of apples between them and cut them carefully into halves. Catelyn had always done that for her girls. Not because apples require that labor, but because she liked the way sharing a small fruit required two people to learn to be deliberate together. They ate and spoke of nothing that mattered, and in the speaking eased the ache of a dozen things that mattered. Sansa told her of a girl on a market street who had sung with a broom. Cat told her of a boy in a mill who had insisted on showing her his mouse. The small stories were not small. They were reclamations. The boy king in his chamber studied the stool he had been given and tried to feel insulted and could not because he was so very tired. The black fish came and said a thing about a sword and showed him how to hold it so that his wrist would not betray him. The boy listened with half his attention and with half of that half in its proper place for the first time in his life. The rest of his attention roamed, as attention does at that age, toward thoughts of the women who had laughed for him and whether there would be anyone here to laugh. There would not. That is a lesson. The old knight did not shame him for the wandering. He moved his hand and moved the boy's with it and showed him what the angle must be if he did not wish to drop the thing when his arm tired. The boy did not sleep well that night. His dreams had grown complicated. In the city changing its habits, Tyrion's chain was not yet a chain but a set of requisitions and a series of arguments with men who believed the river existed primarily to teach boys to swim. Haleen spoke in his phlegmy whisper about wildfire with the peculiar delight of a priest who does not know what to do with his god when it appears. Tyrion fed him coin and skepticism. He wrote to Bywater and told him to see men placed where men would need to be if the river should fill with men in strange sails. He wrote to the queen and told her truths in a way that could be eaten. He wrote letters to no one that he burned when he had finished them because the act of setting them alight gave him the comfort faith gives other men. Cersei met with a septa she disliked and listened to talk of the mother and thought of thorns again and of blood again and of her own mother who had not been enough of a wall. She wondered about her father and whether he would deal in daughter as he had always dealt in sons. She drew Lancel to her again and this time did not strike him when he failed to bring her the name she wanted. And this frightened him more than a blow would have. She began to speak Tommen's name in her sleep. She began to consider teaching him to hold a sword not because she believed in swords but because she believed in things that are held. The ravens went. Stannis Baratheon, reading in his austere chamber where every piece of furniture had been chosen for its refusal to please, held the Lannister compact at arm's length as if it might smell. He saw its legality and spat upon it. His jaw made a shape of stone that even his priestess's heat could not soften. Illegitimacy does not become less so by treaty, he said. A thief's promise to guard the chest does not return the coin. He sharpened his letters the way a man sharpens a blade. He wrote for men who had once believed in his constancy and had found that constancy is not as warming as charm, and he sent them arguments instead of wine. Davos read and sighed and rubbed his thumb across the place where a finger had not been for some time. Stannis looked at the water. He heard there an invitation. Renly smiled at the same news and planned a feast. He was not a fool. He only believed that men are best led toward what is right by pleasure. He wrote for Highgarden and used a tone that was all ease and open hand. Marjorie looked at the letter and saw the shape of a crown where none was drawn. May smiled. Loras smiled differently. They would make their weather when the wind was right. They saw the boy hostage as an inconvenience that could be painted over with garlands. In the Kingswood, a band that would soon be called the Brotherhood walked in a long thin line through briar and birch. Beric Dondarrion had an old weariness around his eyes that no man his age ought to carry, and it made him look noble in the worst and most useless sense of the word. Thuras of Myr sang to himself and let a prayer or two slip out with the wine breath. They were learning that the realm's peace and a lord's peace were not the same, and that the former could be made in the absence of the latter by men who did not own lands. They took that lesson and made of it a banner. They heard that a boy had been taken and returned, and they said either, "Good, and let us see that others are not taken," or else they said, "Good, now we can steal in the space made by greater men's courtesies." It depends on which man is telling you what they said. The first snow fell in the far north, not in any serious way, just a rehearsal. Bran Stark woke in the night with the taste of iron in his mouth and could not say why. He said nothing. He had learned not to trouble men with the way the world looked when he looked with other eyes. A raven came the next morning with a triple-knotted message, and Maester Luwin took it with professional caution and professional delight. He read, and then he read again, and his old hands smoothed the page as if it were a child's hair, and he went to the boy and cleared his throat and explained the words as if they were a set of tools he was laying out on a table for a boy to choose among. Bran listened, and his jaw did that stubborn thing it had learned to do since the fall, the thing that makes a child look like a man without ever making him so, and he said, "Robb will bring her," and Luwin said, "He will bring her." And in that second both of them practiced their faith in the only way men can, by saying aloud what they most fear to say so the gods won't think they are trying to hide the size of their hope. In the time between that hope and its satisfaction, the road kept to its business. Men mended boots and sang. Women patched breeches and sang. The boy brushed horses without being asked on the fourth night, and the black fish said nothing and felt a startle of something unwise and good. Sansa learned the names of 3 girls who carried water and learned how to carry without tilting her head in that way that makes one look a lady at the cost of one's neck. Theon was sent ahead with 2 men and a list of places to stop and speak. He sat very straight on his horse and imagined the words that would fall out of his mouth. They fell with more grace than he had expected when he spoke them the first time to a woman with hands like rope. She listened to him because she liked the way his hair shone and because he said the word winter as if he had known it. He left feeling taller than he was. On an afternoon when the sky had gone, Pewter and the men's breath had just begun to show as small ghosts before their faces. A boy ran into camp from a farm where he had been told to watch the horizon, and he spoke too fast and then slowed and said it as men say a thing when they want to make their mouths do what the moment deserves. "Riders," he said, "not ours." The old knight's eyebrows moved in a way that seemed to go around his whole head. He turned to Robb and said, "We will make an accident. It is a pleasure to watch a mind that has learned how to make necessity sound like charity." They turned the column in a way that kept it looking like a column until it was not. They brought the boy to the middle. No, not the middle, that is where men look for the thing you most value. They brought him to a place that looked like the middle if one did not know the number of men, and the gap where the cart would appear if carts could appear when needed. They laid men in the ditch where a man drops his eyes if he is riding in with purpose and expecting to be praised for it. They piled brush that had been cut for cooking and vertically stacked it in a way that pleased the wolf. The wolf's tail made one single mandatory wag and then went still. The stance of the beast told the men with bows where to look. The riders came as if the road belonged to them, not in the bright arrogance of men who believe they cannot be killed, but in the dull arrogance of men who believe they will not be. They wore no badge. That is a badge. They were the sort of composite the realm produces in times like these. Part hire, part zeal, part grievance. The man at their head had a purse that had been tied by a woman and smelled faintly of rose oil and faintly of fish. His men looked left and saw what they expected to see: the rear of a column. They did not look right, not until their horses told them they needed to. When men do not look in time, their horses try to look for them and are punished for it, and that is how pikes get into bellies. It was not a long fight. It was an argument of 3 sentences. The first was the rush. The second was the meeting. The third was the turning away to consider what had been learned. 2 of the riders died, not because death had been ordered for them, but because men carrying bows and pikes are clumsy tools at sparing. You do what you can in the space you are given, and sometimes what you can do is less gentle than you wish. One of the horses screamed and then went down quiet. The men who had not learned to pity horses yet discovered it is learned for you when you hear that sound. One man jumped from the saddle and hit the ground in a way that told 3 stories about the training he had never had. The black fish took him and turned him like a fish on a board and tied him in such a way that a man with smaller hands could undo it if he knew the trick. The boy king did not see death that day. What he did see was the backs of men he had been taught were his enemies interposing themselves between him and something else without obvious cost to their pride. He did not know what to do with that. He felt anger first because it was a familiar cloak, and he was wearing a shirt that chafed him. He made his mouth open on the old words. Then he shut it. He watched the old knight bind a man and considered for the first time the difference between binding and striking. When it was done, Robb spoke with the small man in the flattened tone of men who have spent around a fire in the counting of what had not occurred. "Coin from the east," Tywin said, and the word east went into the air like a rumor sent out to the fields to germinate. A promise of reward that sounds like a gallant's boast. A letter left at an inn for a man who could not read. He rubbed his thumb across his lip. "I will put a bowl for fish in front of a man who claims to dislike fish and see if he eats." "Little finger," Robb said. "Perhaps," Tywin said. "Or someone who sees what Littlefinger sees when he looks in a glass and finds himself tired of the face." "Circe," Robb said. "Perhaps," Tywin said. "Or a woman who loves her son and hates to think of him sweating like a pig under a canvas in a yard where no one laughs at his jests." He looked at the boy as he said it. The boy missed the look, because youth is a shield no man can take off another's arm. "We will double the watch," Tywin said. "We will do it in such a way that any man coming will see only half the watch and think himself clever." "What will you do?" Robb asked. "I will write to men who will pretend not to have read my letters," Tywin said, and his mouth twitched. "And then I will write letters I will not send because writing them will make me less likely to drink more wine than the day can afford." "You could drink more," Robb said, and was surprised at himself for having said it. "Always," Tywin said. "It has never been my talent." Catelyn watched them from a distance and felt the odd affection a mother feels when she sees men behaving as if they had been children together. She went back to her small business. The work of seeing that the women who had come with the line had the meat they needed and the water, and that the cook remembered to keep a pot aside where there would be no onion, because there is always someone who cannot eat onion, and it is not worth making a separate misery for them when the day's general miseries would do. She checked on the older men who slept near the fires because their bones liked it. She found the girl who had sewn the rip in her sleeve and asked her name, and then said it twice because girls like to hear themselves named by a woman who might be queen and then might not. At night, under the kind of dark that feels like cloth rather than space, Joffrey dreamt again of strings snapping, and this time of a great black sea that came up at him not with malice but with a patient, crushing curiosity. He woke and he did not cry out, and he lay still and listened to. A man breathed on the other side of the thin wall and took comfort that the breath was steady. He did not know the man's name. He could have asked. He did not. Some shames are better lessoned slowly. When they came at last to the walls of Winterfell, the men looked up as men always do before a wall that has held. They look to see whether the stones remember them or whether, like the homes of women who have been badly treated, the stones intend not to let them inside despite the promises they made when they left. The sky above the castle was that clean winter blue that makes a man's thoughts feel washed. The smell was smoke and meat and an old, good cold that has not yet remembered it wishes to kill. The gates opened in the old way, with a notice that sounded like pride without trouble. Bran came on a litter and did not mind the litter because it allowed him to see the faces as they came. Rickon wriggled, then remembered he was meant to stay near, and dug his heels in and looked fierce to make up for his obedience. Luwin was there, and he almost smiled and then did not because the moment insisted upon form, and he bowed, and the boy took his hand and lifted him up because a man who has become family to you must not bow like a servant, and in that movement was a small thing saved. Sansa, in the gate, seemed to disappear and then to resolve again like a thing one sees at the corner of one's eye and finally manages to see full. She stepped forward and the world rearranged itself to make way for the sound of women's hearts. Caitlin held her and then let her go and then held her again, because it is important to remind a body that the door is not the only shape love can make of itself. Bran put out his hand and took hers and looked at her as if he had seen her on a hill and had not been sure if she were real, and then said her name because saying is the spell we keep for bringing the dead back to the living. Joffrey came in with the line, and men looked at him and then looked away in the polite way of men who do not wish to damage a compromise. He saw it and his mouth had almost got itself around a joke when he saw the wolf on the yard and the children and was suddenly too tired again to perform. The black fish took him by the elbow and brought him to a bench and said, "Sit." And he sat and did not understand why obeying a command had felt like something he had done for himself. The feast was not a city feast. There were no courses whose value lies in their intricacy. There was meat and more meat and bread and ale and a fruit pudding that had endured the last of autumn like a champion. And men ate the way men do when they have been using their bodies rather than their mouths all day. The hall of Winterfell warms differently than southern halls. It warms from the people rather than the fires. The boy king found that he could not drink as much as he had thought he could. He found that this was not remarked upon in the way it would have been in King's Landing. He found that men did not look at him first to see whether they were allowed to laugh. He found all that and then lost the ability to sit upright and had to be taken to a bed that had no canopy and discovered that a roof without hangings does not fall upon a man. That night, beyond the warmth, a wind dragged its fingernails along the walls and made the sound that has taught northern children to pull blankets up to their ears for generations. Rickon slept with the dog at his feet. Bran dreamed of roots, white, hard, reaching in the earth like a frozen river. Sansa lay with her eyes open and listened to the small movements a house makes, wood expanding and contracting with the breath it borrows from men, mice whispering, a door shifting about its hinge quietly as if it wished not to wake the old god. Robb stood under the weirwood and looked at the face and asked nothing because he had learned that asking is sometimes impertinence and reverence sometimes means letting a thing be itself without burdening it with your needs. In the courtyard, in a room set aside, the small man wrote letters. He wrote one to Casterly Rock and one to a name he would not write on the outside because the letter wanted to arrive unannounced. He admitted to himself that he liked Winterfell, which was foolish. He would be foolish then. He liked its draft and its stubborn light and the way its walls wore their age without pleading with the observer to be admired. He liked the bread. He liked the way the northern men's compliments were stingy and therefore spent like coin with honest weight. He did not like the boy's face when the boy received his mother's letter, which had arrived by tired bird and had been given to him without delay. The boy had read it and made a face and folded it and put it under his shirt and pretended to forget it there. Tyrion had once had a letter under his shirt. It had stained the skin above his heart with blue from the ink. He could not read the stain. He had rubbed at it for days with wine and spit until it left only a notion of itself behind. He had told no one how it had hurt to rub or how much he had enjoyed it. At dawn, the business of terms resumed, because peace is not a moment but a set of chores. Men were brought in chains and out of them. Names were called and exchanged. An Umber pledged a nephew, and a Manderly pledged a brother's son, and a Fry, no, Caitlin said, and then said it again more sweetly, and then found herself having to spend a comedy of precious minutes explaining the particular nature of no to a man who had committed his life to refusing to understand it. She made herself charming. It was a sacrifice. The small man watched her, and truer admiration moved across his face than any he had shown a woman in months. He bowed to her later when no one saw. He did not tell her why. She would have understood anyway. Letters went out from Winterfell. The world moved slower in some places and faster in others. On the island, D of Pike, a man with salt in his beard and iron in his name, leaned his weight against a notion and found it agreeable to him. His daughter laughed at the letter he sent and then did not, because the letter had written into it the parts of him that did not laugh, and she loved all of them against her will. The crows on the roof of that house and 1,000 like it set a racket to the morning that made men think of old gods or of women depending on the parts of themselves that had most need of absolution. On the black water beyond the city, men in small boats measured spans with a string and did arithmetic with their lips. Above them, men in a tower counted iron that was yet to be made iron. In a shed that had once been used to store breakages of tile, a boy lit a candle and watched it gutter. then trimmed the wick with a fingernail in a way that made him believe he understood something about fire. In the king's hall, Cersei said the word Tommen, the way a man says a name of a jewel. He means to set in a ring, and wear upon his hand and show to men in rooms where men are hungry for the sight of something that has endured and stayed bright. Varys went barefoot along a hallway and liked the feel of stone under his feet because it told him how warm the city was. And warmth is information in the same way a letter is. At Winterfell, men went to the God's Wood in pairs and alone, with shame and without. The king Robb took Joffrey there and said, "Some men talk, some men listen. If you listen here, sometimes the trees answer. Not with words, with a lessoning." He looked as foolish as a boy looks when he tries to explain to another boy the reason he is gentle with a girl the first time and then cannot be again. Joffrey made a face as if he were smelling a bad idea. He stood and did not kneel and did not scoff. That was something. He looked up at the face and saw only a red mouth and pale eyes that had bled into the wood. He did not sleep badly that night. On the fourth day, snow came not as a rehearsal but as a remembered song, and the men set their shoulders into it as men set their shoulders into any old song that has a chorus they can sing. The women laughed, not because they liked cold but because snow makes of a place an erasure, and there is comfort in seeing the world set briefly back to blank. Sansa stood and let flakes stipple her skin until she could not feel her nose. She closed her eyes and lifted her face and thought of a day in King's Landing when she had hung a bit of linen out a window and had pretended it was snow. She felt half ridiculous and then wholly grateful. She lifted the hem of her skirt and ran to the step where she had once sat as a child and sat there again, this new woman who had learned to speak in smaller rooms, and she permitted herself for 10 seconds to be the girl who had named her hair in a looking-glass. "Lady," said Catelyn from behind, and Sansa turned and smiled and said, "Mother," because in Winterfell that word had an old strength to it that it had not had in years anywhere else in the world. They went in and poured a drink and stood at the table and let their hands touch without looking at them. If a goddess had come into the room, then she would have thrown up her hands and said, "This is worship enough." Letters came. One from the Eyrie, where Lysa's fear had widened into a philosophy. It was careful and full of admonition and contained a story about a boy who had nearly choked on a piece of honey cake and been saved by the quick wit of a maid. Catelyn read it and set it aside and did not decide whether she would write back. One from Riverrun with 3 new arrangements of clauses that had already been agreed and would need to be refused kindly. One on heavy paper with the lion stamped deep into the wax. Tyrion took that one in his pocket and went walking with it without opening it. He was not a man given to prayer. He did not pray then. He held the letter as if it were a hot potato and waited for it to cool under the frost. He opened it finally under a sky that had turned metallic with lunchtime, and he read it slowly to make sure it did not change itself between glances. Tywin had written it. The phrases were the sort men used to remind lesser men that they have families. Contained no threats but was entirely threat. It was not unkind. It was worse, it was reasonable. It asked, in the voice of a man who had told the truth about taxes all his life and seen it ignored by everyone, what plan he had to safeguard the family while he chased the realm's peace. Tyrion folded it and unfolded it and folded it and went to find a cup of something honest and warm. He took it to Robb and let him read only the parts that were meant for strangers' eyes. He made a joke that was almost tired and Robb laughed as if the joke were a thing that could keep them from slipping on the stones. There was one thing left that needed doing before the road could take them again. A grave had to be visited. It stood beneath a tree near enough to the God's Wood for the old gods to have something to do with it, but not so near that the gods would feel obliged to listen. Robb went there at dawn with the snow still uncertain in the air and put his hand on the stone and did not say father. He said, "I have made a treaty," and then he said, "I did not ask you how," and then he said, "I have brought your girl home." He pushed his palm hard as if he were trying to push memory back into stone and then laughed at himself for the thought even as he did it. A wind came, nothing the city would call a wind, but northern men bow to what the southern boys think of as drafts, and it moved the hair at his temple and made a sound in the leaves that the old women who tell stories say is the gods answering. He did not credit that. He took it and put it in the place where he keeps such things that are not facts and yet feed a man in winter. He left and went to work. They did not go all at once. Armies do nothing all at once except disappoint. They went as a family leaves a supper table, this one rising for the thing he must fetch from the shed, that one lingering over a crumb, another making a small detour to the door where the boots are kept in order to find the one with the softest lining. It saved them a sprain in the hall of men's egos, kept the yard from clogging. It allowed the women to kiss the men in their own way without making a show of it. It allowed Sansa to stand in the gate and watch the light move over the wolf's back and think about how the southern sun never made a beast look like that. Joffrey took his leave of Winterfell with a moment of stiffness that no one remarked upon and no one missed. He had been measured. He had been found a boy. There is no shame in that where men have sense, and in Winterfell there was just enough sense to go around. The black fish did not offer him advice as they rode. He offered him a strip of dried meat and took his own with his teeth and chewed and spat and made no speech of it. The boy took and chewed and spat and felt a ridiculous sense of belonging that he banished with a curse under his breath for which no one corrected him. On a hill half a day from the castle, a rider came from the east with the kind of hurry that is not show. He had not eaten. He had drunk snow the way boys do, by tipping his head and letting it collect in his curl and melt into his scalp. He spoke to Robb in the language of men who waste nothing. He used the word sails. He used the word black. He used the words narrow sea. Robb looked to the small man. Tyrion looked at the sky, which he always did when a man spoke of the sea, as if hoping to find it there instead more manageable. The old knight looked to the boy, not out of kindness, not out of calculation, but for the simple reason that he had trained his eyes to go toward the greatest risk whenever a word like sails was used. Always, the black fish said, they come when you least like to exercise. Always, Tyrion said, they come because they have better weather than the truth. He thought of the chain and its non-existence. He thought of wildfire not yet racked in the numbers a man could call upon without risking others. He thought of the boy's mother and the way her hand would tremble as she wrote and the way the wax would cool before she had set the seal. He thought of the kindness of gods who have no kindness. He said, Bywater will hold. Bywater will hold. Robb echoed, and in the echo there was something more than an agreement. There was the forging of a man with another, a strange and temporary one. They turned the column on a heel and let it wrap and lengthen. Men chewed and swallowed and made fewer jokes. Sansa sat her horse with her hands inside her sleeves and could feel how her heart had learned a new rhythm these months, that of the march drum. It comforted and alarmed her equally. She looked south and thought of windows and of women who must teach themselves to sleep without noise every night or else go mad. In the city beyond their sight, Cersei stood at a window and put her fingers on the sill again and did not press. She watched men on roofs measure again with strings and watched a priest carry a brazier across the yard and watched a girl hang winter shirts and felt the day come together like a story told by a man with a parched mouth. She said to no one, "Let them come," in a voice that did not sound like a queen's or a mother's or a whore's or a man's. It sounded like the voice a knife makes when it is drawn on a stone. Far beyond even the raven's eye, east in a city where men drank the names of other men for pleasure, a girl with hair like a moon seen in a midnight river stood on a balcony and watched her dragons make small disasters of her carpets. She had learned to laugh at that. She had learned to turn men's desire to watch her into something like heat, to be used as a lamp or a furnace as needed. She felt the wind change. That is a trope, but sometimes tropes are also simply truths. She put her hand on the rail and made a vow, but not the vow you think. She vowed to learn the names of the winds before asking them to lift her. That is the sort of vow that divides girls from women. On the King's Road, halfway to the place where it meets the river, the wolf lifted his head and tasted the air. His man made a small noise that was only a breath turned into consonant. The men to either side adjusted their straps. The boy in the center rolled his shoulders and pretended he did not care and then, in an act of bravery that would not be considered such by most songs, said very quietly, "Where do you want me?" "Here," said the old knight, and put his hand to the boy's shoulder with a pressure that would leave a bruise he would be ashamed to admire later. The boy set his feet as if he had learned suddenly how to be a tree. Robb looked to the small man once more and saw there a mirror of his own thought that did not comfort him or frighten him, but simply made him stand a little straighter. The bells of King's Landing had been rung for less. The bells of Winterfell had not been rung for more. They were not rung now. Men put down their boots and picked up their spears and did not look back for blessing. Women took a last pull of water and set the buckets by the door and put a hand on a lintel and then on a child's hair and then on their own breastbone and breathed out and then in. Tyrion squared his shoulders and felt absurd and wise and small and more necessary than he had any right to feel. Catelyn sat and folded a cloth and waited, as women do, in that holy place between hope and rage. Sansa kissed the back of her mother's hand when she thought no one saw. Bran dreamed of a tree that bent and did not break. Rickon woke and laughed for no reason at all. Bywater at the city's wall ran his thumb along the edge of a pike and found it sharp and smiled his little bookkeeper's smile in. Dee said, to the man to his right with the melted ear, "Hold," though no one had moved yet, and far away, where the water narrows and ships learn humility, sails were raised and lowered and raised again, and men swore their old oaths, the ones that have become comfortable in the mouth and therefore dangerous. The next day will not be like this one. It will pretend. It will offer approximations. It will, if men survive it, become a story that sounds better when the roughness has been filed. For now there is the day's fact. Men kept the boys alive and the boys kept the men decent, and the road waited for its share of trouble as roads do, and the wolf stood in snow that came on now with sincerity, and the sky above them took no side because the sky has seen too many banners not to be bored by color.